Last month, Rick and Morty Season 6 came to an end, and I gotta be real, this was the best season in quite some time. The show shifted focus from evil Morty to Rick Prime as the new big villain. Our Rick saw plenty of development with a robotic relapse along the way, and Jerry got plenty of dubs, although he did suffer through the fortune cookie debacle in the process, but I've blocked that episode out of my mind. I don't want to think about it. Now that the season is over, I thought it'd be fitting to compile all of our coverage in one big video. All 10 episode breakdowns, our speculations on Rick Prime, everything. So grab a snack and sit back as we dive back into the misadventures of the Smith family. Starting with episode 1, Solar Ricks, undoubtedly the best episode of the season that revisits the show's history as a way to set the stage for the future. Picking up the pieces of evil Morty's escape from the central finite curve, the episode kicks off with a parody of Avengers Endgame, with a not so subtle parallel to Iron Man and Nebula being trapped in space as Rick and Morty are on the verge of death within the remains of the Citadel. The surviving Mortys have regressed into a primal state, which is played for laughs, but let's bookmark this development. I wouldn't be surprised if these feral Mortys come back down the road, maybe as trained human weapons for Rick Prime or the Galactic Federation. I hope they all have their rabies shot. The portal guns are still broken as the result of evil Mortys tampering with the fluid, altering any and all portals to be bloodthirsty death traps. Rick equates evil Morty's big plan to a petty quitting Twitter announcement, to which Morty retorts that nobody quits Twitter. I think this actually may be the writers poking fun at themselves and how for years the internet came up with all of these elaborate evil Morty theories when in reality they really only had like a vague idea of what this little menace was gonna do.
He really needed to get into the nitty-gritty of what his actual plan was. Okay, he's president now. Why did he want to do that?
Which, yeah, I guess he did just punch a hole in some intergalactic drywall and left the lobby. But are we gonna act like that wasn't the hypest scene in the show? The gold portal? Bro, I got chills. In context, this joke may also be the writers letting us know that evil Morty really isn't anything to be feared compared to the real threats that are out there. Rick is annoyed at how much fanfare comes with the title Evil Morty because he himself knows what real evil looks like. Rick and Morty prepare for the sweet release of death, but just like how Tony was saved by Captain Marvel, the duo is rescued by Spacebeth, who does her best MCU impression with quips that don't really land. Okay, well, that is a problem in a lot of Marvel movies. Let's take a moment to be grateful that they didn't go for a joke in Endgame when Carol showed up. They don't have that kind of restraint anymore, unfortunately. We have a new Season 6 opening, which turned out to only have one real scene from the season. Jerry clumsily lighting up the fortress of space Hitlers. Good job, Jerry. Once they return home, Rick immediately tries to reset the portal index, but makes a crucial mistake. Instead of resetting portal travel, he resets portal travelers, sending everyone back to their home dimensions. Rick gets sent back to C-137, Morty gets sent to the Cronenberg dimension, and Jerry gets sent back to a Season 2 status quo dimension, courtesy of a mix-up at the Jerry Burrie. Remember Jerry Burrie? The interdimensional Jerry daycare from Season 2? Of course you do, because you think about this show all the time, don't you? Just like me, right? When you close your eyes, all you see is Rick and Morty, just like me? Yeah, okay. That episode left the open-ended question around Jerry at the end of the episode being the same one from the beginning. The Jerry Burrie that spawned the iconic Secret of the Ticket theory that stands at a tall 3.5 million views today and got referenced by the writers themselves. Yeah, bro, that theory, after 6 years, has finally been confirmed. Just take a moment to salute. Holy God. Rick apparently has a chore server for Summer, and we can assume Morty that has a bunch of protocols for different situations Rick may find himself and the family in. We get a look at the chamber Summer checks the chore server in, and we learn that unlike Morty, who just gains trauma and criminal records from these adventures, Summer has a whole ass currency system through a Marvel Powers vending machine, presumably compensated with points, Dave and Buster style, that she can use to cash in on things like cool Wolverine claws. Oh yeah, every file in the chore server is named Booger AIDS. A callback to Season 3's Morty's Mind Blowers, where Rick ran into the same dilemma. He finally takes the first step to rename them here, and the name he chooses, probably harder to commit to memory.
Summer, let's run down.
One-way blind hop reset beacon booger aids.
Spacebeth is ready to dip out, saying she'll catch the family in another 2 years, referencing how the last time we really saw Spacebeth was the Season 4 finale in 2020, and only had a small cameo in Season 5 in which she denies the possibility of becoming a recurring character. Here, however, the status quo finally begins to fold a bit as she tags along on the adventure. We get a good look at Rick's home in C-137, and it is a rough scene to look at. Not only does he have a holographic replay of his encounter with Rick Prime, a string of failed attempts to identify him, but he also built an AI of Diane, whose voice haunts him in every room of the house, reminding him of how miserable of a person he's become, and how he blames himself for the death of his loved ones. No one hates Rick more than Rick. This has been a fact since the very beginning of the series, but now we're truly getting to explore the deep hatred he harbors towards himself. During this downtime, Rick obtains an upgraded version of his ship while waiting for Summer to finish her assignments and open a rift connecting C-137 to the Citadel. It's unknown if he built this ship or if it was like laying around, but it's cooler to say that he just built it, and how thematic that it comes from his OG universe. It actually makes sense for him to get a new ship at this point in the series, not just because the season seems to be acting like a pseudo season 1 as we said before, but also because the last time we saw Rick's ship was in Forgetting Sarek Morchow. By the end of the episode, he was driving the Crow ship, and when he returned to the house in Rick Mirai Jack, it was on the robot horse. So not only did they take a portal to the Citadel, but Rick's ship was already in limbo regardless. I do wonder if that old ship's gonna pop up anytime soon, especially since we do know the new ship is gonna blow up at least once. Rick also apparently set the minds of his neighbors in a time loop, trapping them in the day Beth and Diane died. The paperboy and stylish lady, now old and decrepit, she's even walking the corpse of her dead dog. Never underestimate the power of drunk Rick. Glad he cut back on alcohol a bit over the course of the series. Once the ship and coordinates are ready to go, Rick blasts off into the rift, having his own Steve Rogers in space moment. As he travels through the rift, AI Diane informs Rick of a pretty solid theory. If all portal travelers got sent back to their point of origin, then Rick Prime himself should have gotten sent back to his dimension as well. And with the portal still busted, he's trapped. Morty's arrival in the Cronenberg universe is met with a sight that's even more depressing than the last time he returned here. The overgrowth and vegetation has gotten worse, and the Smith household is completely abandoned. No frozen Jerry, Summer, or Beth in sight. He follows a trail of footsteps to the remains of a convenience store, where a startled Morty impales Cronenberg Jerry, who's evolved from his Viking appearance to more of a Mandalorian-like appearance. Never thought Jerry would have a cool yet threatening aura, but I'm into it. Cronenberg Jerry reveals that this dimension's Beth and Summer have passed away since we last popped by, as Beth got sick from the effects of being frozen, and unfortunately, Summer did not survive the thawing process. Jerry also ponders if some of the Cronenberg civilians are actually still conscious, due to their brains being fully intact. A horrifying thought that really shows how numb this Jerry's become to everything, given that such a thought doesn't really faze him. Morty tries to lighten the mood and find a board game to play, allowing Jerry to escape and steal Morty's belongings in the process. Jerry no longer having any attachment to the son that abandoned him. The events of Rick Potion number 9 ruin the Smith family, and Morty's departure only rubbed salt in the wound. Though, Jerry discovers that Morty didn't really have anything worth stealing. Morty catches up to his father and pleads to let him help, but Jerry remarks that aside from this conversation, his life is perfect. I'm stealing that one because, ouch, emotional damage to whoever is on the receiving end. According to the writers, this is a self-actualized Jerry. It's kind of eerie to think that losing his entire family has led to a Jerry that's way more efficient than he ever was before. Summer and Beth arrive at the Citadel and encounter scavengers who are already beginning to raid the destroyed city-state for parts. Beth attempts to kill one of these scavengers, only to give it a drawn-out, painful death before Space Beth demonstrates the difference between the two by swiftly putting it out of its misery. As they help pull Rick through the rift and stall for time as he goes to save Morty, Beth and Space Beth finally have their inevitable clash of egos. Earth Beth is reasonably soured that Space Beth gets to run from their life choices while she's left in charge to parent them. But Space Beth argues that that's what the clone was for in the first place, to avoid having Morty and Summer go through the absence of a parent that she had to endure as a child. Back in the Cronenberg dimension, Rick crash lands and meets up with Morty, immediately dropping a major bombshell on us. Rick Prime is the true biological grandpa of our Morty. Our Rick's endless hunt for Prime led him to his home dimension, where he never came back after walking out on Beth. Our Rick just assumed his place, hoping that he'd come back so the score could be settled. Rick believes he's tracked down Rick Prime, but is led to a trap, one reminiscent of Rick's trap and gotcha moments that we've seen in episodes like Vindicators 3 and The Old Man in the Seat, but arguably cranked up to an 11. This Rick really is a force to be reckoned with, one that our Rick can only imitate when it comes to being a cold, unfeeling bastard. A Rick that's going to take everything in our Rick and Morty's arsenal to kill. The storyboarding and composition in these scenes, by the way, phenomenal work. Rick is treating this trap like a near suicide mission, which Morty opposes and tries to take the fall for his grandpa, only for Rick to call out that he did that last season. Morty stands his ground and makes it clear that Rick Prime is not his grandpa. He's not the one that Morty spent 5 seasons worth of adventures with. Blood be damned. Morty also slips into the obligatory season premiere line of Rick and Morty 100 years. The two Beth's argument is resolved by Beth interfering as she rescues them from being digested busted, explaining that she doesn't want Space Beth to be her #1 mom or anything. She just wants her to be around more, without either mom fighting for her affection. The family links back up, and we learn Morty had childproofing done on his body to survive in space without a suit. Jerry is rescued from his season 2 level family. His off-screen time with them seems to have humbled Jerry, grateful for the divorce he and Beth went through in season 3, as it improved their relationship for the better compared to how they used to be, which could be a nod towards how season 1 and 2 were littered with subplots and just screamed Beth and Jerry should definitely get divorced. After season 3, they definitely dialed it back, with Jerry just being a dumbass instead of a dumbass who argues with his wife. Returning back to the Smith household, season 2 Jerry isn't happy to find the predicament he's in, throwing a random pot shot at Beth, but he inadvertently causes the demise of himself and the entire Earth by releasing a creature named Mr. Frundles, who Rick captured at some point in time. Mr. Frundles bites Jerry, infecting him and the rest of the household, and soon the planet with horrific Mr. Frundles energy. So just like in season 1, it's new dimension to live in time, baby. Just as gruesome as it was in 2014. And yeah, this new dimension pronounces Parmesan. Also, this dimension confirms there's numerous Space Beths out there. Not surprising, but still very interesting to think about. Are some Space Beth clones? Well, some are the real deal. I don't know, just some food for thought. Portal travel's busted, we got a new ship, a new home, Space Beth promises to come around more often, and Rick Prime is stuck in his OG dimension, or so we think. The season is poised to be quite a wild ride. Capped off by the bone-chilling post-credit scene where Cronenberg Jerry encounters Rick Prime. If you were hoping for a Cronenberg Jerry Space Beth pairing, I got some bad news for you, pal. He's over here striking alliances with mortal enemies. Wow, look at that, Rick and Morty with 2 main villains? That's a good way to shake things up. Oh, never mind. Dude's dead. Interestingly enough, Rick Prime implies he's never met a Jerry before, claiming he never got close to the concept, given he abandoned Beth when she was a child. It's possible he's foreign to not just Jerry's, but fully grown Beth's and Summer's as well. Maybe even Morty's, though he seems to be looking for his biological grandson. Either way, this was a standout premiere that truly knocked it out of the park. Episode 2, Rick, A Mort Well Lived, took a closer look at Morty's current feelings towards his grandfather, while also getting a lot of mileage out of the writer's apparent love for Die Hard.
The second episode of the season is one of our biggest episodes in the season. Morty is split up into billions of different NPCs.
The world is united because the world is one 14-year-old boy, Morty. But where's it all coming from?
Let's recap the events of this episode, unpack the gravity of this ending, and get to the bottom of whether or not Morty's 5 seasons worth of development is gone for good. This episode is more or less a high concept character study of Morty, and also religion, and society, and cults. There's a lot. After the sacred paradise we know and love as Blitz and Chits gets hijacked by alien terrorists, and subsequently has a brief power outage, Morty, who was already logged into the classic game Roy, ends up having his identity fractured across all of the game's NPCs after the game resets. Now, we all know Roy, it's a simulation of life, so Morty's consciousness was fractured between billions of people, which I can't even wrap my head around. So Rick has to go in and rescue his grandson, assuming the role of Roy the only playable character. And because there's billions of NPCs in the game, things get weird fast. We also get some cool Roy lore, basically some Inception rules. Time passes way differently in the game than it does in real life. 1 second out of the real world is equivalent to a month in the game. Time dilation is back on his bullshit, baby. This is some interstellar logic. I love it. Real sci-fi, not sperm monsters, no incest babies. We're back on track. The NPMs, that stands for non-playable Mortys, keep thinking Rick's message is a religion, which leads to what may be the first time Rick acknowledges he's not a god. Some of them easily accept their reality as a fraction of Morty, while some are just way too committed to their character to let go without a fight. Rick needs every piece of Morty to follow him into space and travel beyond the edges of the game, forcing it to kick them out and reset once more. However, after Marta and Rick meet with the president, who feels very George Bush to me, I don't know why, Marta gets to the root of the issue. Morty is very much still torn up inside when it comes to his feelings towards Rick. It's revealed there's a part of Morty, 92% to be exact, that idolizes Rick and appreciates the lengths his grandpa will go to protect him. But the remaining 8% of Morty believes all of that means nothing when Rick still doesn't treat Morty like a grandson, and instead more like a sidekick or servant. Morty still longs for normal grandpa-grandson activities and the bare minimum of love and affection. There's a part of Morty that believes Rick doesn't want to save him because he cares about his family. Rick wants to save Morty because he feels entitled to his family. I wonder why Rick would feel like that. I don't know. And in a twist, Rick is willing to leave this 8% behind, the percentage of Morty that is defiant against Rick, viewing them as disposable, which of course does not sit right with Marta. The delegates of Morty try to come to an understanding, but instead end up on the brink of war over their existential crisis. Marta believes all of Morty's fragments can come to an understanding and leave the game with Rick if he can fulfill the very simple task of telling Morty that he loves him. This does not pan out, and instead wartime ensues. This is so frustrating to watch because I've literally said I love you to like my DoorDash driver. As time passes, the war rages on with no end in sight. Marta now has a daughter who defects to Rick's side, while Marta's father Larry passes away. A lot of pieces of Morty have died in this game, pieces of himself that are obedient and disobedient towards Rick. Sidebar, it's so funny watching these big dramatic scenes because they're still all voiced by Roiland, but not in his typical, I'm gonna voice a lot of the characters and do like slightly different versions of my voice, you know, the classic Roiland style. No, this is just all Morty's voice, and I don't know why, it's just funny to me. This is probably his dream episode. Anyways, in Larry's final moments, he disapproves of Marta's plan to stay in the game, pushing Marta to wave the white flag and sign off on all NPMs to leave the game with Roik. Yeah, that has a good sound to it. Every Morty that was against leaving the game at that point was just following Marta's lead, but she feels like she's a relic. Marta no longer represents them, so she's setting them free. The fragments all fly off into space as Rick and Morty re-enter the real world and help Summer finish off her Die Hard. Oh yeah, there was an entire B-plot where Summer had to do a Die Hard and kill the terrorist, but she's never seen it, and the boss, voiced by Peter Dinklage, who does an incredible job, has modeled his entire life off of Die Hard. It was kind of one note and probably done to make the writer's room laugh more than anyone else. Oh, that reminds me, this episode was written by a Season 2 veteran, Alex Rubens, who wrote Big Trouble in Little Sanchez. The episode did feel a little classic in its high conceptness, you know, like earlier seasons, so it's not only nice to see an older writer return, but to retain the strong sci-fi with the spin premise that the show was so famous for. Even having a movie reference, which is weirdly how Rick and Morty got its start. Literally every episode was like a film parody. Anyways, the family's adventure may be wrapped up, but the episode ends with some pretty major information. All but one fragment made it out of the game, with Marta staying behind to live a full life as Rick paid off the arcade to keep the machine in storage while an external battery keeps it running. This effectively means that the one piece of Morty that defied and rebelled against Rick is no longer a part of him, but instead has been separated and preserved, but only to Rick's knowledge. Boy, this potentially opens a whole can of worms that may have ultimately reset Morty's character. But before we dig into that, let's focus on what we learned about Morty and where his head currently is. Look, it's clear through a lot of the interactions in this episode that Morty still has a lot of self-esteem issues to work on. Marta's dad apologizes for degrading her haircut and calling her a, play the clip.
Called you a slutty jobless hobo?
Marta's haircut is obviously just Morty's haircut, meaning he thinks his own hairstyle is shitty and overall thinks poorly of his own self-image. And I mean, Morty, I won't cap, you can grow your hair out a little, okay? You're allowed to change your style. Get some tattoos, king. But don't be afraid to love yourself and remind yourself of what you've got. No one could pull as many out-of-league women as you do, bro. Literally women, by the way. I don't know how they got away with that episode, but it's Adult Swim. This bit also implies that Morty believes he has nothing going for him when he's not going on adventures and saving the world. We've seen through the series that Rick has taken away Morty's chance at a normal high school life, as Morty really doesn't have any friends, doesn't have any extracurriculars, or do anything for his own mental health outside of video games and beating off. Sadly, the ending of the episode doesn't inspire confidence for any of this changing in the future. He thinks some parts of himself are more valuable than others.
We're all part of Morty. Some of us more important parts than others.
This is a direct effect of his time spent with Rick. Rick has hammered in the idea on multiple occasions that although Morty's valuable, it doesn't mean his ideas, interests, or desires are worth anything. If it can't service Rick in a way that he finds meaningful, it's pretty much pointless. Which kind of came together in the fact that he was willing to leave it behind in order to get any part of Morty outside of the Roy simulation.
It's not your finest 8%, Morty. 8% of the Snyder Cut was Batman dreaming.
I don't know what that reference is.
Morty still doubts himself even when it comes to one-liners, which is evident when Roy Rick says he's jinxed Summer, leading to Marta overthinking to a soldier fragment. Morty still isn't completely confident in his decision-making, even when he's like literally leading the entire world as a fragmented version of himself. Rick has caused Morty to develop a ton of self-deprecating habits. This is best reflected through Marta's interaction with her father Larry, which despite being a part of Morty, acts a lot like Rick, especially with the constant berating and use of sarcastic remarks to constantly tear down, sprinkling in positive affirmations only when she does either what he wants her to do, or when she gains notoriety and admiration from others. Sound a little familiar? Yeah. But what the episode ultimately tells us about Morty is that he still longs for a genuine relationship with his grandfather. He doesn't just want to be taken seriously as an equal, a partner in crime, which season 5's two-part finale communicated. He wants affection, simple gestures, the occasional I love you, which, again, I swear to God I have given to like the Taco Bell night shift employee before. But Rick is just too guarded of a person to let that happen. The death of his Diane and Beth, and his inability to avenge them, has plagued his mind for so long that although he clearly wants to be around his family again and is attached to this specific version of them, he doesn't know how to express simple emotions. Whenever Rick does show any kind of affection, it's through weird sci-fi grand gestures, and that's what love is in his mind. I mean, after all, avenging his wife and daughter at this point is the grandest gesture of them all. Though little things, no matter how important they may be, simultaneously mean nothing and everything to Rick, because of what he's lost. The little things may mean he's comfortable, and he just can't allow that. Because if he's comfortable and acknowledges his attachments, it's going to hurt all the more if and when somebody in the family gets seriously injured or straight up killed. Rick can already never be the same again, that after everything he's been through with Morty, he still can't bring himself to be sincere with his love. Part of the reason he so desperately craves control is so he can avoid having to do that again. Rick's a tragic character, bro. I know they tell us like every 10 episodes, but sheesh, it hurts every time we're exposed to it up close. So with all of that being said, let's get to the biggest question of the episode. Did they just reset Morty's character back to square one? Keep in mind, this season is clearly acting as a pseudo season 1 of sorts. Portal travel has to be fixed, we got a new ship, the family's living in a brand new dimension. I guess to complete this status quo it only makes sense to backtrack a bit when it comes to Morty's spine. By Marta sending all the Morty fragments off and conceding to Rick, but staying behind in the game, and even being kept alive by Rick, every part of Morty that he retains is seemingly now obedient towards Rick. And look, if this is true, I'm gonna be honest, this is a big shame, because so much of Morty's development up to this point revolved around him breaking free of Rick's control and standing up to his grandfather despite all odds. Again, wanting to be taken seriously as an equal without Rick holding back on any secrets and instead communicating like a normal human being. Yet at the end of the episode, Morty completely folded after being put down by the part of himself that was developed through his time with Rick, and once again, sadly, settling for the bare minimum from his grandpa. After their near-death experience with evil Morty, and Morty talking Rick out of playing into Rick Prime's trap, it's disheartening to see this unfold, to say the least. But I won't lie and admit that it's a little nuanced. As the ending shows the bad and good in Rick, yes, he was okay with removing the part of Morty that had enough gold to stand against him, but instead of wiping that part of Morty out entirely, he instead decides to keep her alive, which I think is a layered decision. This shows that Rick did get attached to Marta during the game, and did what he could to give her a happy ending. Because he recognizes her as a part of his grandson, he loves her, even opening up and saying that he had some time to reflect, which is something Rick barely ever does. On another level, I think this could tie into everything that's going on with Rick Prime. There are some pretty heavy implications that Rick Prime is looking for Morty. Morty did vocalize his concerns that Rick may be keeping him around to lure out Prime. But what if that's the opposite? What if Rick wanted to protect Morty and he feels like the best way to do that is to wipe all of the work Morty has done on himself and reduce him to his submissive, coward-like former self? I mean, this episode did pick up in the middle of everything. We never saw how this happened. Anything is possible at this point. If Rick can make sure Morty falls in line and doesn't defy his orders, he can make sure in his fucked up Rick way that Morty stays safe. Alternatively, he may be afraid that Morty might end up following Prime and abandoning him for reasons that aren't clear yet, so screwing over Morty's development may keep Morty from straying over to the dark side. But let's not pretend that either way, Rick is getting to have his cake and eat it too by maintaining his emotional unavailability, but still getting his grandson to obey his every order without any pushback. Considering the show brings back story elements at random, I do think that Marta will return and fully restore Morty's sense of self down the road. Maybe when Rick's plan backfires and he needs to get Morty's defiance back in order to save the day. Look, there was that end scene for a reason. It's not going away, and this is not the last time we've seen Marta or Roy, especially because Roy is like such an iconic in-joke in the series. There's no way they're not going to return to it at least once. I just hope this wasn't some stupid, convenient way to double back on Morty's entire character development so they can do more episodic, seemingly simple adventures where Morty goes back to being like, I don't know, Rick, because it's easier to write, which I want to make very clear I do not think is what happened. After the season 6 premiere, I give the show a lot more credit than I did before, but from an episodic, we have so many episodes, they can air in any order standpoint, it does feel like they opted to have Morty's sense of defiance and individuality stuck in Roy, so he doesn't have a reason to be on a semi-same level as Rick, something I felt he genuinely was at this point, especially after the season 6 premiere, and I don't know if I like it, just I guess we'll have to keep watching, like the sheeple we are. Episode 3, Bethic Twinstinct, is when the season really started to get into that good old-fashioned Rick and Morty degeneracy.
Is Beth a woman that's allowed to like herself?
Okay, so this episode opens being another holiday episode, specifically Thanksgiving. We know this because Rick literally enters as like a turkey and alludes to being pardoned, which is some weird lame ritual the White House does every year. I don't know, it's all capitalism. This is like, I swear to God, like the 5th Thanksgiving special this show has had, and they even joke about it in the episode, which I thought was pretty clever. Anyways, Morty is installing a brand new video game system, which apparently has some of the most realistic games in the world. I mean, this man's literally played Roy. I don't know what his expectations are, but okay. Now, right off the bat, this kind of feels to me like a sort of half-baked sister plotline to like Interdimensional Cable, but with video games. I suspect they probably meant for this to be like an entire episode, and I can't lie, that concept sounds like it would translate really well, but you'll see soon this plotline takes quite a backseat. So he reveals he got the console from Space Beth, and that she's visiting for Thanksgiving. The show features a typical awkward Thanksgiving dinner, very on brand for the Smiths, where Jerry alludes to the fact that he will literally kill himself if Beth cheats on him or leaves him, definitely not alluding to anything at all. Early on in the episode, you can tell that Beth and Space Beth are just really getting along. So well, in fact, that the two eventually have a quasi-romantic moment. And this is where the episode, it gets weird. Now, Summer saw this and immediately throws herself into the video game to distract herself and just not have to think about it, which kind of ends up being the B-plot. On top of showing these funny video game parodies where they turn up the realism all the way, they're funny, they're creative concepts, but the A-plot is just so out of pocket that I don't know. So Beth and Space Beth spend some time getting to know each other a little bit more, and yeah, it's as weird or not weird as you make it. I'm still processing it. It's very Rick and Morty. Anyways, Earthbeth kind of feels guilty and then goes to Rick and kind of alludes to what's going on, to which Rick explains that he's been there before and gives her some vague advice along with his condolences in a weird way. So Earthbeth and Spacebeth continue their romantic relationship in secret while Jerry is none the wiser, because he's literally Jerry. This kind of reaches a head when everybody in the family finds out in one way or another, and they catch Beth and Spacebeth living out their lives in a simulation, something Rick points out is a Black Mirror reference, which I thought was pretty funny. So with tension at an all-time high, Spacebeth just bluntly breaks the news to Jerry, to which he responds by retreating into a bug shell. Yeah, I guess Rick installed that. I mean, it just makes sense. Rick reveals that he's stuck in that shell and won't come out unless he's ready to, causing Beth and Spacebeth to have a heart-to-heart about their individual lives. They both decide it's best if they just forget about all of this, and enlist Rick to, quote, eternal sunshine them, which basically means just erasing all the memories of them being romantically involved. Something Rick points out is selfish, but who is he to talk? This causes Jerry to come out of his shell and put his foot down. But as he goes to pack up his stuff and leave, before anyone worries that we're gonna have a repeat of season 2, the show does a very sexual 180. And I'm not gonna get into details because I want this video monetized, but the three make up their differences. I can't even begin to play what happens. It's just audio, and yeah, stuff happens. Something the rest of the family has to unfortunately hear. They allude to the fact that portal technology is still broken.
You need to fix the portal gun, Rick. Morty, you asking me makes me want to do it less.
Spacebeth leaves, and the Smith family is back to normal. Well, as normal as they can be. So it was a whirlwind of an episode, I won't lie, but that's not to say there's not a lot we can break down. There's a ton of information this episode gives us, some deeper insight into the characters and their relationships, and overall just a lot to say. So without further ado, let's dive deeper into this episode, and no, that wasn't an innuendo, and yes, you're gross. In case there was any shred of doubt left, Beth is a tried and true narcissist, backed up by the man himself, Dan Harmon.
Anne Lane proposed that maybe the Beths would be into each other. It made a lot of sense to me as a narcissist.
But this leads to Beth having an extremely unconventional arc, par for the course for Rick and Morty. Instead of growing as a person by having to make sacrifices, get humbled by loss, and gain empathy for others, you know, the stuff you'd come to expect from these kinds of characters, Beth is dealing with the exact opposite. Beth is able to explore other paths in her life, figure out her own identity, and now even rack up sexual experience with another partner, without having to change a single thing about the life she settled for with Jerry. The closest you could physically get to having your cake and eating it too. That sounds really weird in this context. I'm gonna move on. Beth has proven in these episodes that even when she makes decisions that'll benefit others, she's still ultimately working in her best interest. She wants to work things out so it stops inconveniencing her. While the spotlight is usually on Space Beth for her innate cool factor, what we learned about Earth Beth is nothing to ignore. To build upon the previous point, it's obvious that the domestic lifestyle isn't bringing Beth to her full potential, something Space Beth tries to remedy, and she's pretty vocal throughout the episode that what she's built in the cosmos isn't hers but theirs. It's reminiscent of the philosophy a lot of Rick shared, how the multiverse is theirs for the taking, and they can do whatever they want throughout the cosmos consequence-free. Beth is living by that mindset flawlessly. Beth doesn't face a single comeuppance in this episode. She has an affair with herself, gets caught up by her children and dad, who all help her cover up in the end. Jerry finds out, but he ultimately decides he's cool with it. I mean, the Beths were ready to just retcon this episode out of their brains completely, and he told them not to for his comfort, and that if his wife did leave him, he'd just cry and be pathetic about it for a while. But out of all the enablers, by far the most interesting one, when it comes to his history with cloning and his daughter, is Rick. Being Rick's daughter means there's pretty good odds you're going to inherit his super intelligence, incredible battle skills, sci-fi drip, and overall sense of superiority. Speth, or Space Beth if you want to be boring, locked out on this completely. When it comes to her behavior, Space Beth is the spitting image of her father. The show isn't shy about the fact that Space Beth ultimately is going through a phase, one that Rick repeatedly reminds his daughter he went through in his prime. You can read Space Beth like a book, and has since her season 4 debut. Rick had enough foresight to call the two Beths hooking up, as he himself experimented with clones back in the day. Yet instead of steering her in the right direction, or one that is quote morally correct, Rick is feeding into Beth's narcissism, and pushing her to have everything she wants. And the reason why is obvious. Rick is projecting. His biological Beth died tragically before his very eyes, and he blamed himself for decades. He's always felt like he's a terrible father, and for the longest time, all of his attempts to redeem that image in his mind were met with pushback from Beth. The turning point for this is found at the very end of season 3, when he not only introduces Beth to the cloning lifestyle, but also struggles to kill a potential duplicate of his daughter, claiming he was coming after Jerry's life instead, but folding all the same. The ending of that episode saw Rick resign the power he held in the family for Beth, for the sake of staying in her life and keeping her happy, because he can't bear to part ways from her again. And we know Beth holds the power in the family from this point onward, because instead of Rick endangering the family in the next season finale, it's Space Beth. Flash forward to this week's episode, and Rick is helping Beth get away with her affair, while instilling more of his philosophy into her. I guess Rick believes if a loving, naive Beth is one that's prone to getting killed, a cold, hyper-aware Beth is one that'll survive in this cold world. It makes me wonder what future Space Beth will be like. Jaded, old alcoholic, maybe she's wearing a lab coat too. What if Morty has a kid? I smell a reboot. The only thing Beth hasn't experienced yet is interdimensional travel. It makes you wonder if it's something Space Beth hasn't cracked yet, or something she just isn't interested in. And again, this episode brings up the fact that portal travel is still busted, and Rick's reluctant to fix it, which we'll tackle in another episode this week. I mean, maybe Space Beth will play a role in interdimensional travel repair, but seeing how she handles one singular clone, I can't imagine how messy a multiverse of Beths would be. Still, it's important to acknowledge the way Rick treats Space Beth is always under the impression that he's been there before. He acted the same way and could care less about whatever scenario she gets herself into. For lack of better wording, he's been there, done that. This is a problem that he ultimately created from experience. Again, he was enabling this affair based on his past experiences. From the original clone problem, to Jerry's bug formation, to even the Eternal Sunshine Plan the two Beths try to go through with, Rick is caught in the middle of and directly responsible for the entire mess that is this wild episode. Side note, I think the fact that Rick hooked Jerry up with this and was evidently drinking with him also shows that Rick doesn't hate Jerry as much as he used to, or acts like he still does in present day. He loves and is attached to all of his family. But sadly, this episode shows that Rick's dynamic with the two Beths is ultimately doomed to fail. Eventually, Space Beth is going to age into her own unique version of old Rick, preferably a version with better fashion sense. Seriously, Rick, what kicks are you wearing, bro? Smartest man in the galaxy, zero drip.
It's
unbelievable.
Not good.
Alright, enough stalling. Let's talk about Morty and Summer's newest trauma. Alright, let's address the kinky elephant in the room. This episode went places. Places I don't think I was fully ready to go. Like, I watched this episode by myself, and thank God I did, but I can't help but feel like it was just as weird to be watching this alone, especially without headphones on. Anyways, this episode did manage to tie up some serious loose ends regarding the awkward position Jerry and the Beths were in. Like, one version of her definitely left him, but the other was the most faithful, and by proxy, their marriage is finally solved, but also maybe she's just a clone and it's all actually super sad and pathetic and fake. Either way, it's very Rick and Morty to leave the situation in a permanent Schrodinger's cat scenario, and I fully believe we'll never truly know the answer. Like, I don't think there is one. Regardless, what this episode managed to do was answer the question, what does this throuple mean for their marriage? Is Jerry gonna try and make it work for both of them? Is he just gonna stick with his girl, the one who stuck with him? Well, this episode gave us answers we may or may not have needed. In the final moments of the episode, the three of them patch up their weird energy with a very electric scene. One that we don't get to see, but are forced to hear. And there are no greater horrors than ones created by the human imagination. Jerry is a cuck, but also somehow is elevated from the pathetic position he was in because, I mean, come on. If you're at the water cooler and your coworker overshares about how he has two wives who are the same person, but one's an intergalactic war criminal, and they all get it on every now and then, you're gonna feel just like a little bit of envy towards him, but also he might be schizophrenic because that's some wild rhetoric. Either way, it's like, yeah, you know, please don't ever open your mouth about it again, but also nice, man. You know, good W. Jerry also came full circle, opposing his parents' open marriage in season 1 to being one himself, cuck and all. Beth is just like her father, and Jerry is just like his. Oh god, I forgot about the Superman thing. This is a very twisted family. Bottom line, they seem to be happy, and are now in an even better position in terms of Space Beth popping in and out of the series whenever she decides she wants to, and the writers can think of a good way to work her into an episode. The other important takeaway of this episode is that Beth and Jerry are finally in a truly good spot. This was solidified when Beth consoled Jerry in his bug shell and expressed so deeply why she loved him. It's a twisted love, but I can't lie, on some level, it's super sweet to see. I think we can all agree the show's lower points were always centered around Beth and Jerry. I mean, the divorce just didn't land at all, and seeing these two, or technically three of them, get along finally is great. It's kind of saying goodbye to the messiest part of the show in a way. Now that the three of them have an established and solid dynamic, as weird as it is for me to think about, we can focus less on their dumb relationship drama and just move out of incest territory. I don't know what they were thinking. It's the least defendable thing in the world. I will always despise it and hate the show for it. And yeah, tragically, he exists in this dimension too. I mean, they had their out. I don't know who on the team is really sticking their neck out for this idea, but it's just not it. So all in all, why does this make Space Beth so dangerous? To round this all out, let's talk about this episode and how it fits into the bigger picture of the series, because the trajectory Space Beth is heading in is a dangerous one that makes her dangerous. If she's willing to repeat Rick's past mistakes, enduring the same trials and tribulations that he's gone through, then it's only a matter of time before her actions catch up with the family. I don't think it's possible for the Beths to keep up their winning streak, especially because of their father's track record. Eventually, something bad's gonna happen to knock them down a peg, and I think that something bad has to do with the family Beth wanted to hold on to so desperately. See, even her character analysis is starting to sound like Rick's. It's getting weird. If you look back on the show's earlier years, the turning point was definitely when Rick's status as an intergalactic criminal collided with his ego in the iconic season 2 finale, the Wedding Squanchers, putting the family directly into harm's way, and when Rick had nowhere else to run, he decided to put the family first and save himself later. Luckily, this all helped the Galactic Federation play right into Rick's hands, and eventually everything worked out in his favor, but I don't think things will tie up in a neat little bow for Space Beth. History has a way of repeating itself. Space Beth is already the biggest op of the new Galactic Federation, so there's reason to believe that they're going to come swinging with a vengeance. In fact, we still have yet to see the family go up against those robots with the new Federation color scheme, as spotted in the trailer, but unlike when they went up against Rick, this time the Federation will have a much better idea of what to expect against Sanchez's daughter. This episode leaves Space Beth placed on a pedestal with an extremely inflated ego and the assurance from her family that everything will go her way, paving the way for high stakes and heartbreak on a magnitude never before seen when she does finally inevitably lose. Whether that means Space Beth has to sacrifice her own life, or if she ends up with blood on her hands, could you imagine a Rick and Morty where Jerry or Summer or even Earthbeth is dead and we just have to live with the consequences of what that would look like? It'd be crazy stuff. And at this point, I feel like they could do anything. You could say we're looking too deep into it now, but seriously, keep an eye out. Because by letting her get away with everything here, they're certainly building up for a bigger downfall later, just like they've done with Rick in the past. And this would still fuck with Rick's head because at the end of the day, whatever mistakes she makes, he's gonna feel compelled to take responsibility for. Dark times ahead for the Smiths, people, but Rule 34 artists are thriving, so it's a win-win. Episode 4, Night Family, was a cool Halloween-esque episode that takes place directly after Thanksgiving for reasons. Did I mention these episodes aired in September? In case it wasn't obvious, this season does dive into Rick's relationship with each of his family members. The premiere was all about Rick's relationship with himself. After that, we checked in on Morty's feelings through Roy. Last week, we saw how Beth continues to mirror her father, and this week scratched the surface on Summer's relationship with Rick, and how she might, actually resent this man. Let's get into it.
It really emerges that Summer's resentments, her deep-seated problems with her grandfather, are taking shape in the form of this rebellion of the Night family.
Let's start with a quick recap, aka this is just a Jordan Peele movie. Night Family opens up with an excerpt from the poem Fragment of an Agony by T.S. Eliot. Although the episode leaves out the last few words, the excerpt reads, "When you're alone in the middle of the night and you wake up in a sweat and a hell of a fright, when you're alone in the middle of the bed and you wake like someone hit you on the head, you've had a cream of a nightmare dream and you've got the hoo-ha's coming to you." I'm a level with you guys, I did not know this is a real poem. It just sounded really goofy and I figured it was like a parody of a poem, but hey, the more you know. So, some fun trivia. This fragment was intended to be a part of a longer play. Sweeney antagonizes fragments of an Aristophanic melodrama, but it landed in the publication of Eliot's collected poems as an unfinished poem. But here's the thing, I don't think this was completely meant to be an elaborate poem the writers pulled from to leave us in deep thought and decipher the ways it relates to the overall themes of the episode. I think it's just meant to take the piss out of Jordan Peele films, because Night Family is basically just an homage to Jordan Peele. Both Us and Nope open with some sort of statement, that being a piece of trivia in Us, and a Bible quote in Nope, that tie into the story and broader themes of both films. Though at the time of this episode's production, only Us was released, so it's safe to say they just made a lucky guess and this becoming a part of Peele's style. The episode's premise is basically a spin on both Get Out and Us, the body-jacking surrealness of Get Out, combined with the bizarro doppelganger horror of Us, right down to the gravelly voices of their night selves, but we'll get more into that later. The episode opens with Beth awakened by Jerry's ear-grating snoring and decides to go sleep on the couch, where she's startled by the presence and sight of Rick doing mad crunches in his sleep. The following morning, Rick explains that he bought a device called a subnabulator that programs Rick's unconscious body, or his night person, to perform tasks while he sleeps. Naturally, the entire family wants in, Rick caves, and needless to say, hijinks ensue. Also, the subnabulator is a riff on the term subnabulate, which means to walk when asleep, which they do a lot more than walking in this episode. Let's just get into it. At first, everything is going perfect, and it's only making their lives better. Summer's learning Spanish, Beth's picked up a new instrument, and both Rick and Morty have supreme washboard abs. So successful, they were able to build an entire podcast around it. Jerry's happy too with the simple task of just being a pen pal with his night person. Even though everyone makes fun of him, Jerry always defends whatever lame stuff he's doing, whether it's a puzzle or communicating with his subconscious self. However, because this is Rick and Morty, things quickly take a turn. Jerry tells the family that his night person made a request, something that they're not really supposed to do. He wants them to clean their dishes better, something that Rick immediately takes offense to, putting his foot down saying that they work for them and that he'll never do anything for his night person. That's just not how the dynamic works. He receives a rude awakening the next morning when he finds that all their dishes have been broken by their night selves. And that's when it becomes overwhelmingly clear that the episode is taking an eerie turn. Something about something physically happening while you're asleep that you did but have no recollection of doing. I don't know, honestly, that's kind of freaky. So Rick, being as stubborn as he is, decides it would be easier to go off on a space adventure and create some indestructible dishes rather than just complying with his night self. Unfortunately, this is not enough to quell their anger. When Rick goes to sleep that night, he is woken up by his night family, and this is when they're revealed to be truly just fucking terrifying. They have glowing blue eyes, they talk like the Us people, and we learn the biggest bombshell of all in the hierarchy of the Night family. Rick's not the top dog, and instead Summer is. They then torture him by forcing him to eat the crusty food off the plate he refuses to clean, and he wakes up the next morning throwing up. Rick immediately confronts Summer, only for them both to realize that the problem is a lot worse. The Night family has launched a full-on attack on the Smith family, locking Rick out of all of his science equipment and keeping them prisoners in the house. Rick decides to improvise. He designs a suit to keep Summer permanently awake and sends her her in is a fake deploy that night, discovering the Knight family has an ulterior motive, a greater plan, to basically extend their consciousness to being full-time hosts of the body. The next morning, Summer claims to have defeated them in her plan, but even that turns out to be a trap by the Night Summer. I don't know how she does it, it just seems kind of convenient, but don't think too hard, it's fine. This is when things go from bad to worse. The Knight family flips the script completely and ends up enslaving them, forcing them to work all day and go into these sleep pods at night. This is where the us metaphor kind of comes into play a little bit. You realize like there's some cleverness in making people work for you and class systems, but it's great and would be explained better by somebody who's a lot smarter, but you get the gist from watching the episode. Also, my favorite part of the episode I want to mention is just this DVD gag where Beth is forced to sort out of like day and night DVDs. It's a nice touch, it feels like classic Rick and Morty. Imprisoned by their night selves, Rick admits that he actually has no way out of the situation, especially since portal technology is still broken. That's when the episode takes yet another twist. Jerry leaves a note to his night self, harkening back to their old pen pal days, asking for help, and you realize, oh my god, are we gonna see Jerry save the day, which is always satisfying. And that's exactly what happens. Jerry's night self wakes up the family and helps them escape the house. Morty accidentally sets off a trigger that blows up Rick's new ship, which never gets fixed. Yay! They escape, getting into a high-speed car chase with Night Person Summer. There's a fun climax sequence, a lot of explosions, and it ultimately all comes down to Night Jerry trying to broker a deal of peace between the two families, as long as Rick can just admit to clean his dishes, something he'd rather lose than actually do, leading to the Night people winning and the credits rolling. We see their victory in the background, they go on vacation, it's kind of funny, and at this point I had no idea where the episode was going. Then we see the actual ending. It's a while later, and the night versions of the family have completely drained their finances and decide it's actually legitimately hard to live during the day and be full-time people. So they give their consciousness back to their day versions, and the episode wraps up on the sad conclusion that they've canceled the Choco Taco. This episode was a wild ride to say the least. It felt like some classic Rick and Morty shenanigans, and overall it was just so funny. I'm glad they're doing one-offs like this. But with Rick and Morty, there's always something worth exploring in the episode, and this time it's definitely Summer's relationship with Rick. Does Summer low-key hate Rick? So here's the thing. The sheer existence of Night Summer speaks volumes about Summer and how many negative emotions towards her grandpa she represses, locking all the bad vibes away to the dark depths of her mind. Like, when I take a moment to really think about it, while Summer has checked Rick before, she hasn't blown up on him or confronted him in ways that Morty, Beth, and Jerry have, or at least in the ways Jerry's tried to. And it makes sense because Summer's kind of the only one who hasn't been directly affected by Rick's presence, the same way everyone else has. Morty was forced into adventures with him, stripping him of a normal life, Jerry lost his marriage for a hot sec, and Beth not only has extreme abandonment issues, but a literal double life thanks to her dad. These are all things that Summer has been indirectly affected by. But when it comes to her direct relationship with Rick, she kind of gets the best deal out of all of them. Don't get me wrong, Rick has led her through quite a bit of BS, given her quite a bit of trauma, and Naruto the incest baby, which again I'm refusing to acknowledge, and we just had the whole do a Die Hard situation, though the circumstances around that kind of forced her hand more than Rick did, yet things tend to work out for the best at the end of every 22-minute adventure. And because her relationship with Rick has evolved into him generally respecting her, hanging out with her, and hooking her up with cool sci-fi gadgets, Summer feels as if she has no reason to hold a grudge against her grandfather. After all, she is Sum Sum. They relate to each other due to his old man nihilism and her teen angst. But the reality is, Summer does have a reason to hold a grudge against Rick. Several, in fact. It doesn't matter that he hasn't fucked up her social life or personally wronged her in any way that affects the status quo. It seems that Summer, deep down, can't stand what Rick has done to the people she cares about. She never came to terms with what Rick did to Morty's original family and dimension, or the fact that for a moment, he really made it seem like he could care less if she died at the Citadel. She never got to process the fact that he momentarily tore the family apart by being the root of Beth and Jerry's divorce, because they got back together before she knew it. But we still had multiple episodes of her struggling to cope with it. And whenever we see Summer cope with her life, which has been plenty of occasions now, it's almost exclusively through the things that Rick provides to her life. Mostly crazy sci-fi stuff. The insane intergalactic adventures, the gizmos, the space drugs. These are all things that come from associating with Rick. Rick is how Summer copes with Rick. And now all of those unaddressed issues took the chance to manifest themselves into the evil mastermind that is Night Summer. And the worst part about all of this, Night Family makes it evident that Rick has no idea that Summer feels this way. He just wouldn't think twice about Summer, or if there were anything troubling about her perception of him. I do think it's interesting that even in this episode, Summer and Rick don't really feel the need to have an actual conversation about their relationship, and probably just wrote off Night Summer as the result of a bad product, or in Rick's case, a lesson on why he should have been the only one to have a night person. But as Night Summer says, she's something that's always been inside of Summer, festering, which is a really scary word. The final thing I want to cover is Summer's big bad potential. Night Summer's terrifying capability and performance as a leader actually got me thinking about how terrifying Summer's potential really is, and if an alternate reality Summer could end up becoming a huge threat in the show, having this episode serve as some crazy foreshadowing in the long term. And while that may sound like a stretch, Summer is the only character who hasn't had some kind of standout alternative version of them appear in the story. Rick has Rick Prime, Morty of course has Evil Morty, Beth has Space Beth, for better or worse, and Jerry even has fully arced out Cronenberg Jerry, although he's technically dead, but that makes him kind of even cooler. What all these variants have in common is they all represent a void of attachment. So Night Family might have just shown us what's coming down the pipeline, even as far as 2 or 3 seasons from now. God, this show is never going to end. A Summer Smith who has been majorly screwed over by Rick, and thus has no real attachments. A Summer who's a great leader through sheer manipulation, just like Night Summer, who was able to convince Night Rick to turn against Day Rick, which means she convinced a part of Rick not to be selfish, which isn't an easy feat given the stalemate they were in. A Summer who wants to conquer by any means necessary, playing dirty and thinking quickly on her feet, because she's Rick's granddaughter. I mean, Evil Morty did lead the Citadel as president, so parallels could be drawn there, but his plan, at least at this stage, was to escape from the status quo and live in a dimension where Rick was no longer the smartest man alive. This is where a serialized antagonistic Summer could differ from Evil Morty, as she wants to conquer the status quo. Whereas Morty just wants to reclaim what Rick's stolen from him, Summer really wants to take everything Rick has to offer, to the point where even when she does lose something, it won't really feel like it, because there'll be a billion other things to fill that void. Summer has been a queen before and loved it, so the foreshadowing was already there. Perhaps this Summer could wind up being our Summer, finally disillusioned with Rick and very vocal about that disillusionment. But only time will tell. At the end of the day, Night Family made one thing clear. Something is brewing inside of Summer, and if her and Rick don't acknowledge these issues soon, it's gonna get ugly. At the very least, extremely scary, which is what the Night Family was. Let's just say I will be sleeping with the light on tonight. Judge all you want, I am not sorry. Episode 5, Final Desmithation, sure was an episode that changed the way I look at Panda Express.
They find themselves in the middle of a mega corporation that is profiting from controlling fate.
The episode opens with them at Panda Express, a classic Rick and Morty move now at this point, I guess. And the core of this episode, the whole point of this episode, basically being Jerry gets a fortune that turns out to be real, and then Rick and Jerry have to go on this crazy expedition to infiltrate the world of fortune cookies, leading to them ultimately finding out that fortune cookies are this insane tool used by the rich elite to control fate. And even weirder that it's all just because of like an alien that like
stripping randomness from space-time and leaving behind super dense pockets of energy that bend entropy towards definable outcomes.
I believe it. There's so much to love here, and I was on the edge of my seat the whole time. But why? Why was the fortune for Jerry to...
Come on and fuck already!
I get being weird and dark with it, okay? And they could have kept it here, man. They could have just made the weird out-of-pocket joke. We'd all like awkwardly chuckle, and they could have moved on from it. But no, the show keeps doubling down. And yeah, there's something extremely hilarious about like fate bringing this insane situation together. Like Jerry's mom randomly calling and randomly wanting to visit. Like the early part of the episode, it was so funny to see because you're like, there's no way they're actually going to do this. And nobody actually believes Jerry, Rick included, until he does some sci-fi measurements, some tests, which again are really crude. Like if it was any other situation, I feel like this would be like a really fun sequence, but because it is what it is, and he has to like decide which hole in the box, I don't know, maybe it's just me. Before we move on, there is a few things I want to mention that were interesting in this episode. There was some continuity. They mentioned Sleepy Gary, which I enjoyed. Reminds me of a better time. Oh, also, Rick's old ship is back after the old one blew up last episode, thanks to the creepy Night Family. And I hope this isn't like permanent and he somehow gets his new ship back, because that would just be a really weird status quo change to only have for like 4 episodes before just getting rid of it entirely. All of these little moves, Space Bath, Rick's new ship, it feels like this show's maturing in a way, so it'd be kind of sad if they just went back to the old ship after all of that. It's like, what was the point? Maybe it's so they can sell it as like an action figure. Maybe this is just a whole merch thing. I wouldn't put it past the show, and I'm not even mad. Like, make your money. I don't care. Anyways, back to this episode specifically, I do want to highlight a few more things that I think think really worked for it before I get into my issues. I love a Rick and Jerry episode. I do. I love these two together. I think it was funny that he was dressed as Morty for a second. Even the gag there in the context of the episode made me laugh.
Why are you dressed like Morty?
Because Morty's mom is Beth.
I'm not unpacking that.
I love the slow escalation, like the pacing was great, going back to the Panda Express, then discovering the corporation. Even the plot is just so funny, smart, sharp. Rick and Morty. I love the Gwyneth Paltrow parody. I'm like 99% sure that's supposed to be her. And most importantly, I love seeing Rick get so excited about discovering this. I think the power scaling in the show has been so weird since like the season 3 premiere. Seeing Rick get humbled and like put back in his place has made the show a lot more interesting. The show basically painted Rick as a god, and now that he's not anymore, it makes me want to root for him like way more. Like even the fact that he discovered this and immediately wants to conquer the fortune cookie's power shows that he is already not in control of fate, even though like part of my mind thought he just kind of could do anything. I also love the fact that if you don't complete your fortune, you're just effectively immortal. Like this is some good sci-fi. Like this reminds me of like the Mr. Meeseeks days. It's awesome. And the fact that Rick wants this power to be immortal reveals that he's not immortal, which I guess they never said he was, but there was that episode where he died and like it showed his whole protocol for basically staying alive forever. So I just assumed he was pretty much immortal, but it dawned on me in this episode because of what Evil Morty did, that whole plan is sabotage, like it no longer works. If Rick dies right now, unless he's got another trick up his sleeve, that could be it, which is scary considering he's facing his like deadliest threat ever, that threat being Rick Prime. So yeah, it just puts him and the rest of the family in a super interesting place and kind of raises the stakes. The best part of the episode by far, besides the old man who controls the fortune cookies, was the fight scene at the end. Seeing him fight with those fortune cookies and like all of the guards use their fortune cookie powers, I had to go and rewatch it like 4 times because there's so many jokes, it's like a mile a minute, and they all land, like they're all just so out of the box and hilarious. Like the soldier that only shoots headshots, to which Rick immediately uses him as just a weapon. It's some pretty creative stuff, I can't lie. And finally, I love that they just gave this plot line like the entire episode instead of going back and forth between like an A and a B plot, especially because the B plot is literally just them going to the zoo with Space Beth. So halfway through the episode, when I realized that they weren't gonna cut back and this is it made me appreciate the fact that Rick and Morty can do A and B plot episodes but also just sole A plot episodes. But all of that being said, that's about where my love for this episode ends. Because if I'm being honest, I was not a fan of the threat of the episode being the looming threat of Jerry
doing it with your mom.
Look, I think it's funny that the old man was trapped there and started sending like SOS fortunes, and then eventually when nobody listened, he just started putting that in there. Like that is a funny explanation, I can't lie. But I gotta call this show out for a second. Look, Rick and Morty has always been weird, okay? I mean, season 1 had the Mr. Jellybean scene. Like it's always been insanely out of pocket, and it always walked that line. I'm not gonna lie. It's a weird show. Look at the pilot it came from. This is some weird source material, and the fact that they turned this into one of the most profitable and commercially successful animated projects of the last decade is mind-blowing. And that's why I want to circle back to the merch stuff. I don't think anybody could have predicted how big Rick and Morty got, and I think that it took them a couple of seasons to kind of adjust to that and just figure out what they wanted to do with the show. I don't think the show ever wasn't genuine, but I think it just had to adjust to the weird power it had. Like when you make a weird one-off reference to a McDonald's sauce and then you get people rioting in a McDonald's, I cannot imagine the feeling in that writer's room. And I think Rick and Morty is a show that is just always trying to shock us, unapologetically so. And these last 2 seasons have given us some of the most shocking moments so far. But I'm just gonna say it, they gotta chill it with the incest stuff. What is this? And I'm not calling it out on a one-off, okay? I'm not against edgy humor. I'm not a little snowflake, okay? I can take a joke. I can laugh at some messed up stuff. But once is enough, Rick and Morty. Once is enough. You already canonically have an incest baby in space. You already did an episode with the anthropomorphized sperm war, where Morty befriends his own sperm and then impregnates his sister. That's the episode that aired on television. I feel like I should go to jail for saying that out loud. You already crossed some lines, bro, and we all looked past it, okay? You named it Naruto, and we had to just smile and nod because we wanted to see that evil Morty, and you kind of suck because you did it. You gave it to us. These lore-heavy episodes have been so fulfilling as fans. It's been so great to see the show actually building up to something, delivering on everything it's been setting up. These have been some of the best episodes of the show. So why, for the love of God, are we having to sit through all of these incest plot lines? You did a whole episode about Beth hooking up with herself. Give us a second to breathe. Oh my God. I can't watch the show with anybody. I have to watch it alone because I'm so freaked out about what the episode's gonna be. I can't comfortably watch this show in a room with other people. And it feels just as weird to watch it alone. I get dark humor. And I applaud you for still going with it. It's cool that the show is staying true to itself, that it never tried to be anything it wasn't. I can confidently say, in its many season run, Rick and Morty has never not been itself. It's always been unapologetically itself. It's cool, even if that's really weird sometimes. But I feel like there's a line maybe, before you just start alienating your audience. As weird as the plotline is, it could have ended there, and this could have just been a funny episode with that weird part that we all just kind of sat through. But you showed us it. There was the scene. You know what I'm talking about if you've seen this episode. The final scene where Rick saves Jerry just in like a second before disaster, that we had to look at this image of him naked and that's tattooed in my brain. You poisoned my brain. This is not just me. There are memes about this now. I see TikToks about this. We are all baffled at the amount of incest humor that the show has recently featured. I feel like this is a situation where it's like 3 strikes you're out. I don't know how much more of this I can handle. This is like strike 2.5. I understand that they may want to shock the audience, that they still may want to be like out of pocket sometimes, because honestly, only Rick and Morty can. They can feasibly do pretty much whatever they want with this show, okay? It's just gonna make a ton of money. It's just so successful at this point. It's so big, and it's animated, so like just realistically, they can show a lot more than what you can do in a live action format, including stuff like this. But that doesn't mean you should. At a certain point, you have to acknowledge you're up in the Target t-shirt section, okay? You gotta play the game a little bit. I'm not saying dumb down the show or make it any less weird. As a fan, I would just be happier if they refrained from going in this direction so strangely often. Okay, that wraps up my little rant. And honestly, I'd love to hear from you guys about this. How do you feel about this episode? Is this too far for you, or do you think it's just funny? Am I just lame? I might be. I guess I just wanted to address the point that I feel like Rick and Morty has gone in this direction where it just tries to shock the audience or be really weird, and it always has. But now that the show has such a rich lore, now that we're in such an interesting part of the series, and the show has done such a great job of just re-establishing the core cast, their dynamic, the power scaling, I would, as a fan, prefer if they just leaned into that a little bit more, as opposed to being as shocking and out of pocket as possible. Because my jaw was unhinged this episode, and not in a good way. Now that we're halfway through the season, let's pump the brakes a bit and talk about Rick Prime. What's his deal? What do we really know about him? Well, let's take it from the top in our little intermission. Rick Prime is now home, and with the portal index yet to be reset, it's hunting season for our Rick Sanchez. It's clear as day that Rick Prime is now acting as the big bad for Rick and Morty. We wrapped up the Evil Morty saga, and now it's time for a new overarching main villain. We may know Rick Prime as the man who murdered our Ricks Beth and Diane, but the reality is his influence on the events of the entire series cannot be understated. And the recent revelations of the season 6 premiere only hammered that in further. So as Rick and Morty moves into brand new territory, we here at the Roundtable thought it'd be appropriate to recap and break down everything we know about Rick Prime. All the hints planted throughout the show since season 1, his relation to Morty, and why he's been so hard to find all this time. Our hope is that by laying this all out on the table and connecting all of these dots, it'll be easier to figure out his endgame moving forward. So without further ado guys, here's everything we know so far. So the best place to start would be actually addressing the name Rick Prime and how it affects the evolution this character has had in the writer's room. When this Rick first popped up in the Rick Shank Redemption, he lacked a proper title other than Dickhead, and wouldn't properly be named until he appeared in Pocket Morty. He would be made available as a costume at Salesman Rick's shop, being referred to in-game as Weird Rick, which would be adopted by the fandom as his canonical name. And while you may be thinking, oh, it's just some gotcha name, I'm not going to take it too seriously, we can actually pinpoint where the name is referenced in the show. Season 1's Close Encounters of the Rick Kind, which we all remember for its iconic introduction to the Citadel and Evil Morty, features a scene where quote-unquote Evil Rick displays a leaderboard he made of Ricks across the multiverse, ranked from evil to least evil. While our beloved C-137 Rick gets to gloat about his rank as number 1, Evil Rick himself is oddly only number 3. In between them is an unidentifiable Rick that Evil Morty points out as the anomaly, simply calling him super weird. And that's our first key detail. Rick Prime has always stood out as a top-tier Evil Rick. Obviously, he's depicted as just a normal Rick here, but that could be explained with the reality that they had no idea how Rick Prime was gonna look all the way back then. I mean, come on. The team already admitted they revisit old story-heavy episodes before writing new ones. Plus, in the context of the episode, it's just a bit about how all of these Ricks in the spectrum look the same. Still, considering he was given the name Weird Rick during the Season 3 era, makes this moment feel like less of a coincidence. Not to mention, this is also the episode that mentions the central finite curve, alluding to Rick's backstory and, again, Evil Morty. So it'd be weird for all of those details to end up factoring into the overarching story, only for this one to mean nothing in the grand scheme of things. It just doesn't add up. Not to mention, we know why he had a name change. We already had a Rick Prime. Don't believe me? Go on Google, type in his name, go to images. How do you feel? Feeling real low IQ, huh? I'm just kidding. I hear you typing aggressively. Please chill. But yeah, before the Council of Ricks ceased to exist, we had a Rick Prime with a curly mohawk and sometimes a soul patch. That's definitely a look. Who really had no significance at all and ended up being murked in the Rickshank Redemption. So the likely scenario is that they were calling the new Rick Prime Weird Rick internally for the longest time. And once they began writing season 6, they realized we should probably give him a name that won't sound super goofy after they embraced the name Evil Morty in canon for a bit. I really don't think they like that name considering they made a joke about it in both Rick Mori Jack and Solar Ricks. Sidebar, saying these absolutely goofy, stupid names in a serious, theorizing tone will never be lost on me as one of the goofiest things in the world. I wear it as a badge of honor. Okay, back to the video. But while we're talking about him, since we know Evil Morty was controlling his Rick and clearly has known more than he lets on for a while, it's possible he's actually trying to test our Rick here to get information on Rick Prime by pointing out his super weird standing in the ranks, aiming to get a reaction out of Rick, and being met with disappointing results. It's cool to look back on the show and think that even if they didn't have every detail figured out, they knew Rick Prime would be a big deal even back then. And honestly, seeing how the story panned out, it's kind of perfect, and I'm here for it. Now let's talk about the first time we actually meet Rick Prime. Inside Rick's slightly altered memories, back in the Rickshank Redemption, Rick Prime arrives into C-137, Rick's home, as if on cue, while Rick is trying to develop a portal gun for simple teleportation, rather than interdimensional travel, signified by the blue portals. Rick Prime is on the scene to speed up the process, presenting Rick with the knowledge of inventing interdimensional travel in this dimension, pitching it as godhood, the ability to escape consequences, with nobody being able to stop him, claiming Ricks don't pass on this when C-137 declines the offer. This is the second detail. Rick Prime has a green goblin complex, feeling entitled to power, devoid of attachment, and taking it upon himself to, quote, liberate other Ricks from their own attachments so they can achieve godhood.
Gods don't have to choose.
You can't take no for an answer, and for all we know, may actually have an agenda around Rick's becoming self-absorbed dimension hoppers. When Rick pushed back against Prime, Prime decides to motivate Rick with vengeance, blowing Diane and Beth to smithereens. This prompts Rick to crack the code on interdimensional travel and embark on a galactic, multi-dimensional journey to find Rick Prime, slaughtering countless Ricks in the process. Though, through this we learn the third and fourth key detail about Rick Prime. He's a master of illusion, with his inability to be found, and he seems to be sought after by other Ricks as well. One of them, our C-137 Rick Shoots, had a red string conspiracy board of numerous Ricks around a tapestry of what would become the Citadel of Rick's insignia, meaning before the Citadel was formed, there could have been a cult of Ricks promoting a similar idea of superiority, and the Rick killed by our boy here was trying to organize all of the Ricks part of said cult with the hopes of finding their leader, which from what we've known was probably Prime. This idea is corroborated in Season 6, Solar Ricks, as Prime's pre-recorded message isn't talking to a specific adversary, implying he has a pretty extensive rogues gallery. Of course, he did tell Cronenberg Jerry that he was naked to mess with Rick's head, so it isn't too unreasonable that he had his video message be addressed to anyone just to bruise Rick's ego, but also, if Prime is hiding from numerous Ricks who were wronged by him, he could still be doing both. Speaking of Solar Ricks, let's wrap this up with the season premiere. Check out our breakdown to get the gist of the episode if need be, but here we learn key detail number 5. Rick Prime is Morty's true grandpa, and C-137 Rick was just assuming his place at the start of the series. Morty is attached to and loves the Rick he spent the most time with, but he's bound by blood to the one who lit the candle in the first place, fundamentally changing the way we look at the show. But this also means that Rick Prime is the Rickest Rick, not ours, which C-137 admits at the end of the episode.
He's the real deal.
The post-credit scene also drops a major bombshell. Key detail number 6, Rick Prime is effectively immortal. Cronenberg Jerry tries getting the jump on Prime by slitting his throat, leading to Prime pulling an Uno reverse card as the rune regenerates in an instant. He also hasn't aged a day since his encounter with C-137 Rick, appearing exactly the same time while our Rick has drastically changed in appearance, at least twice between his look and age during the Space War and his current near senior citizen status. Our Rick already has quite a bit of cybernetic enhancements and a handful of ways to recover from serious injury on short notice, but Prime seems to elevate things to the next level. We also learn that Rick Prime works alone, claiming partnerships have been planned out for him in the past. After declining Cronenberg Jerry's alliance, he might be looking for our Rick and Morty, given that he asked if Jerry ran into them for reasons unknown. Prime seeing Morty tagging alongside Rick would have been the first time that he met his true grandson, and knowing his grandson is already capable of surviving high-concept sci-fi adventures may have piqued his interest, especially since this is now the only family Prime has left. To cap things off, I want to leave some food for thought with what I find to be the key detail through Solar Ricks. That detail being, Rick Prime is literally playing God. We've seen Rick grapple with having a god complex throughout the series, as he became increasingly invincible, and it's clear Prime has a complex, but he takes it to a completely different level. Let's unpack what this base in the Prime universe really is. It's a place where Rick Prime gets to be an all-knowing, all-seeing, invisible man in the sky. I mean, come on, what else does that sound like? He doesn't want to be perceived unless it's to push Ricks towards their destiny. He thinks he knows what's best for every Rick out there. He wants to remain in control, he wants to be revered as a god. When you look at previous seasons, a lot of the one-off episodes tend to play into a general theme. Something Season 4 went out of its way to challenge was Rick's status as a god, accumulating in the Season 4 finale where he gets humbled and has to accept that if he's anything, it's just a bad father and a bad friend. So I don't think it's coincidence that Solar Ricks is followed up by an episode where Rick has to clarify he's not a god to the non-playable Mortys within Roy, despite having a message of truth from another world. Rick in the show itself is now directly opposing Rick Prime's ideology, and if they're doing that, you know the season finale is about to have shit hit the fan with a confrontation for the ages. At the very least, I want to know Rick Prime's skincare routine, because that guy is looking good for his age. Jeez. Smartest man in the galaxy. You should have a partnership with Sephora. Anyways, there you have it, all the key information we have about Rick and Morty's newest big bad villain. And with this information, we can get to theorizing. What do you think Rick Prime's ultimate goal is? Do you think he wants to seek ownership of Morty or the family? Maybe he just wants to be friends with all the Jerrys or something. I don't... Cut that. That was stupid. Our Rick has had many run-ins with ye old Grim Reaper. Actually, wait, we haven't seen a real take on, like, the Grim Reaper in the show yet, have we? Weird. Feels like they would have used that one. I guess that's only Family Guy. Anyways, the show is full of Rick's near-death experiences that usually go hand in hand with the attachments he refuses to let go of. But now Rick wants to have his cake and eat it too. As one of the newer episodes, Final Desmithation followed a classic Rick and Jerry adventure that ended up turning into Rick's quest for immortality. Learning about the insane lore of these fortune cookies and the apparent invulnerability they grant the consumer piqued Rick's interest, and is the first time in the show he really seemed adamant on wanting to live forever. But the reality is, Rick wants to achieve immortality so he can settle the score with his wife and daughter's murderer after getting embarrassed by him in front of Morty. Morty had to basically talk Rick out of a suicide mission, but between Rick keeping the portal index busted and this newfound drive to becoming immortal, it's clear to me that he's planning on a rematch, keeping Prime trapped in the Cronenberg dimension long enough to level up, hunt him down, and get his revenge. However, all of this also exposes the fact that Rick doesn't know how to become immortal, and given all the protocols and measures he has in place to preserve himself across the multiverse, I think Prime is the only one who's managed to crack the code. But how? That's what we're here to talk about today. I want to take a crack at the mystery of Prime's immortality. How does he have instant healing? Why hasn't he aged a day since Rick's first encounter with him? And can Rick ever get on his level? First things first, I want to get the obvious answer out of the way. Rick Prime, like our Rick, is a huge nerd. What does that mean? Well, Prime was the one who seemingly invented portal travel before anyone else, passing his knowledge onto the rest of the Ricks, but forcing our Rick with no choice but to crack the code himself. Given how insanely genius Rick already is, it's not far-fetched to think that if he already solved interdimensional travel, he's able to solve immortality. I will openly admit that Rick Prime's super healing factor and youthful glow are all things that he just figured out off screen, and the show will just play it straight without there being much of a big mystery to it. But where's the fun in that? The show's had grand reveals before, like building up the central finite curve, things that people could piece together with context clues years ahead of time. So what if we've already seen an explanation for Rick Prime's immortality in the show? If they really want to get Galaxy Brain with it, and validate Justin Roiland's comment of how Season 6 will reward longtime viewers of the show, then Rick Prime's immortality may be a result of several things we've seen in the show. For starters, it could be the immortality field from the Whirly Durly conspiracy. Remember that wacky Rick and Jerry adventure back in Season 3? They went to space, Six Flags, there was a restaurant manager who tried to turn Jerry into a hitman. It was fun. Well, the entire gimmick of that theme park is that it was covered in an immortality field, which in turn allows guests to slaughter each other guilt-free, because they immediately heal from their injuries. You can't convince me this place wouldn't turn the average citizen into a raging psychopath. Now, not much is known about this immortality tech, since it hasn't been mentioned before or after in the series, but who's to say that Rick Prime wouldn't already be in the loop with how it works? He could have easily gone to one of these resorts, across the different dimensions, stole their invincibility field tech, and reverse engineered it, implementing the technology into his own cybernetic enhancements, encasing himself in an immortality field, similar to how Evil Morty Morty, and even our Rick have had fields around their bodies for things like protection or damage absorption. So just like everyone at this immortality field resort, Prime can instantly bounce back from the lethal blows dealt his way. The only thing really contradicting this idea is that healing from the immortality field and Rick Prime's throat practically regenerating are depicted in two completely different ways. The immortality field generates a glow around those affected, whereas the slit in Prime's neck practically closes on its own. It's really freaky. The visual inconsistencies could be explained by the team wanting to maintain the mystery, and frankly because it looked cool in the moment, or just by this logic. The tech is in his body rather than around his body, but either way, this would be a fun callback more than anything. Fortune cookie invincibility. But after this week's episode, I was thinking, what if Rick Prime's immortality has to deal with the fortune cookies? This one's pretty straightforward, as we uncovered it in Final Decimation. The world of Rick and Morty is a world where fortune cookies stem from an alien whose waste bends the rules of probability. Yeah, that. And because of this, until your fortune is realized, you're essentially immortal on a technicality, as Jerry and the other characters in this episode were able to evade death and walk away from altercations unscathed due to the fortune's protection. Who's to say that Rick Prime hasn't already been following Rick's plan from the end of the episode? Rick was pissed at Jerry because as long as he avoided the fortune's claim that he'd make a new friend, he would have held on to his immunity. Didn't Rick Prime tell Cronenberg Jerry that he doesn't really team up with people anymore? Sure, he gave Jerry his own reasons, but that doesn't mean he can't be hiding knowledge of a fortune that's giving him an added layer of protection. Hell, this fortune could even be something that doesn't have an expiration date, like you will create the best version of yourself or something. Applying this fortune to the vast multiverse of Ricks out there, making the quote best version by handing these Ricks the key to interdimensional travel and stripping everything they love if they refuse. That'd be a cool twist, and ultimately could build up the show, returning to its philosophical roots. Rick Prime, as we said before, playing God by also playing fate against our Rick who's lost his faith in everything. Now it's worth mentioning that in the episode itself, fortune cookie immunity seems to be almost reflex-like, as evident when Rick uses Jerry as a human shield. There was also a fortune that straight up said you cannot die, and backfired in this poor guy's face, as he lived through his body being shot up and had to lie on the ground as he felt his shattered ribs. Man, this was a dark one. Rick Prime didn't dodge Jerry's attack, nor did he just shake off the fresh wound, but maybe the cookies work differently for everyone. And the you cannot die cookie seemed like an unfortunate loophole more than anything. But now I want to shift away from Rick Prime's physical invulnerability and uncover the root of his mind games. For decades, Prime could not be found, and as revealed in Solar Ricks, he has his own invisible hideout in space, one that he's expecting Rick to find him at. How is Prime able to stay 5 steps ahead? Well, what if he's gotten so good at being hidden because he's been able to evade death in more ways than one? What if Rick Prime has been using death crystals? You know, from the season 4 premiere, Edge of Tomorty, Rick Die Repeat, crystals that show you the millions of ways you can kick the bucket. It teased evil Squanchi being controlled by the Federation, something that hasn't come up yet, but I'm sure we'll see real soon. Just like how Morty tried to use the death crystals to manipulate his way to the most likely outcome where he ends up with Jessica, Rick Prime could be implementing them in a similar way to constantly stay alert of his enemies. Now this isn't really that far-fetched, but I'm sure plenty of pissed Ricks have gone after Prime before, and considering he's been shown to use only green portals, I'm not sure if he's left the central finite curve. Though I do believe Prime could have harvested death crystals in a way that made him hyper-aware of his surroundings. Not omniscience, since he doesn't even know why he's back in his home dimension, but sort of a built-in alarm system in his brain to warn him whenever danger's coming. A sort of spider sense. Last but not least, I do want to throw out a possibility around Rick Prime's lack of aging. Again, odds are he's just cracked the code on things our Rick hasn't yet. But what if his youthful appearance is tied to Operation Phoenix? You know, the protocol Ricks across the multiverse have in place, where they have clones of their body, held in stasis underneath their garage, lying dormant until a Rick dies, at which point Ricks are booted up and retain the memories of their previous bodies. It was a whole episode, it was cool. Operation Phoenix was far from perfected by our Rick in Big Trouble in Little Sanchez, and it was only because of other dimensions having the same protocol that he was even able to survive in Edge of Tomorty. What if Rick Prime simply just has a more refined version in place, replacing his body with a new vessel every time it remotely begins to expire, keeping him in perpetual tip-top shape, looking pretty good I might add. Rick Prime, call me. Whatever the case may be, I do hope Rick Prime's immortality has a cool twist on it, something that changes the way we watch previous episodes of the show, only cause the show has managed to pull that off so many times before. At the very least, I hope it amounts to more than another Marvel reference.
Hey, remember like a second ago when you pretended not to know who Iron Man was? Who was that for?
And before we get back to it, my boy Kev will take over for a sec to fill you guys in on a big misconception with the show, and which characters are from Dimension C-137. Take it away, bro.
You are wrong about Dimension C-137, and Rick is very disappointed in you. But it's alright, homie, because a lot of people have got it twisted, and we're here to help out. At the top of Season 6, Rick, Morty, and Jerry were all sent back to their home dimensions, after Rick's attempt to reset the portal index instead reset all of the portal travelers. In our breakdown of the episode, right here on the roundtable, I clarified that while Morty returned to the Cronenberg dimension, Rick returned to C-137, which prompted a flood of comments to all say a variation of,
"You idiot! This isn't C-137! Morty's home is! I thought they made it pretty obvious!"
Well guys, when you put it like that, I guess I'll just have to hand you this clown nose! Cause you taking a fat L, bozo! Y'all, the internet is still holding Pickle Rick and High IQ over our heads. We cannot be caught slipping like this. So fam, I'm gonna set the record straight and make it clear why Rick's home is C-137 and Morty's point of origin has yet to be given a real number. And to stay in the loop with more Rick and Morty content as the season rolls out, including breakdowns that we get up the morning after the episode airs, why not subscribe to the Roundtable with notifications on? Just throwing it out there. But let's get the ball rolling. So let's turn the clock back to Season 1. Classic Rick and Morty adventures. Throughout the 11 episodes of this freshman season, there are 2 episodes where Dimension C-137 specifically is addressed by Rick Sanchez. In Raising Gazorpazorp, Rick makes an offhand reference that he is from C-137, but this doesn't become story relevant until a few episodes down the line with Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, where the Council of Ricks identify our Rick as C-137. Now keep in mind, at this point, Morty has no idea that he and Rick hails from a different dimension. Remember, the story he's running with is that our Rick walked out on Beth when she was a child, stumbling back into her life not too long before the start of the series, as a burnout who needs a place to stay. Because of this, if Rick is identified as C-137, Morty is going to make the reasonable assumption that he's from C-137 as well. But that's just it. It's an assumption and nothing more. And when we return to the Citadel in Season 3's The Rick Shake Redemption, Morty once again identifies himself as C-137, but this time, the show makes it a point for us to see the puzzled reactions of the Ricks questioning Morty, because they know that C-137 doesn't have a Morty. We know from Rick's crybaby backstory that after Rick Prime killed his Beth and Diane, he went on a massive Rick killing spree, and to atone, the Council of Ricks were formed. This is when they would have gotten his identification for their database. And this is before Rick showed up to Morty's doorstep. Let me reiterate, Rick did not meet our Morty until after the Citadel of Ricks was formed, and the Citadel got his identification as C-137. It's also worth mentioning the Jerry Beret in Season 2's Morty Night Run. When filling out the Jerry Daycare form, Rick writes down that he's from C-137 while filling out Jerry's dimension as not available. At that point, Rick and Morty already hopped to a new dimension in Rick Potion number 9, but this reinforces that Rick doesn't know the identification number of every universe off the top of his head. And it also reinforces that the dimension he's from, again, the dimension that the Citadel has documented in their records, is not the same as the dimension he's in at the start of the series. But the first time the show really conveys this is Season 5's Rickternal Friendship of the Spotless Mort. Rick interacts with a younger memory of himself that at this current point in time is still hunting Ricks, but has yet to settle in what would become the Cronenberg dimension. Thus his grossed out and disappointed reaction when he learns that he'll grow into a Rick that settles down in dimensions where Beth is alive. And that in itself means that this was already a common practice for Ricks to switch dimensions. This is probably another factor into the Citadel's identification system. Ricks are allowed to live in different dimensions, but thanks to the system in place, they cannot escape the truth of where they really come from. So just to make it clear once more, the dimension where our Rick's Beth and Diane died is C-137. Morty is not from C-137. He's from the Cronenberg dimension. up until Rick Morai Jack and Solarix, he just made the reasonable assumption that he was C-137, because that's what his grandpa was being called. But in actuality, the Cronenberg dimension doesn't have a canonical identification yet, likely because, going off of the name Rick Prime, this is the Prime Dimension, the Mac Daddy of them all, forever tainted and ruined by Rick. So there you have it. I'm sure I'm gonna get comments in this video saying, we already knew this, why did this need a video? But go back to that season 6 premiere breakdown, look at those comments, and tell me this video wasn't warranted. Also, I like money. And as always, I want to know what you guys think. Is the Cronenberg dimension the Prime dimension? Does its number even matter? And am I somehow wrong and Morty is actually from C-137 and I'm just totally watching the show wrong? Me and the people who religiously edit the Rick and Morty wiki.
Back to the season, episode 6, Jurassic Mort, robbed us of a 3-episode arc according to Rick, as his ego was challenged by none other than dinosaurs.
Dinos begs the question, like, what if Rick had to go up against an enemy that was just good and moral?
Basically, the episode opens with Morty just trying to go to school, because despite everything he's been through, I guess he still wants to get a standard public school American education. But I'm not judging. Our boy's very studious. I'm proud of him. Rick tries to take him using portal technology, but admittedly, it's not all the way there yet, leading to Rick having to drive him to school. I don't know where his ship is at this point. They use it later in the episode, but just seeing Rick behind the wheel, hands at 10 and 2, it just feels so weird and off-putting. This season has truly humbled him. Morty gets to school where everyone is understandably terrified of his presence because everywhere he goes, some crazy sci-fi tomfoolery happens to follow. And that's literally exactly what happens. Now, we all know Rick and Morty is not shy with its movie parodies, and these aliens that show up really give me some Arrival vibes, down to the shape of their ship, to the fact that they show up all over the world. Definitely feels like a nod to that movie. In a crazy twist, these ships turn out to be not aliens, but dinosaurs, and not the ones we're used to seeing on Earth. They're far from Jurassic Park. It turns out that dinosaurs actually conquered the world themselves and left Earth willingly, going off into space and becoming a hyper-intelligent utopian race that helped civilizations all over the universe. They finally returned to Earth and are noticeably unhappy with what humans have done to it, citing the amount of Marvel movies we made as a key reason, which I just thought was like a funny dig. Judging by the state of the MCU right now, they're not wrong. But because they're super hyper-intelligent, they're not violent, and instead relieve humans from their duties and positions of power and basically just take over the world for them, creating a utopian society where nobody has to work, there's no war, there's no famine, and generally just bringing some world peace. Essentially turning everybody into Jerry. Realizing his untapped potential, Jerry prints his manifesto about how you should never try and do nothing, which is pretty hilarious. Meanwhile, the president is unhappy with this new state of the world, claiming that it's boring, and enlists the help of Rick to get rid of them. Rick makes a deal with the president that he will as long as he gets to host the Oscars, which is just a super Rick thing to do. But when he goes to try and get rid of them, he's only met with kindness. The dinosaurs even giving him a brand new working portal gun. One that's arguably way better than Rick's, where you can actually see through the portals. And this is the first time we've seen any other being outside of Rick have portal technology, so this is kind of crazy. Again, we're starting to see some cracks in the whole smartest man in the multiverse shtick. Determined to find some dirt on these seemingly perfect dinosaurs, Rick goes on a mission to visit all of the societies that they've quote-unquote helped. This leads to my favorite bits of the episode, where we see other alien planets try to interpret dinosaurs in the same backwards way we have, stitching together bones and creating wildly inaccurate speculations. However, Rick makes a startling discovery when he realizes that every planet the dinosaurs go to gets hit with a massive meteor, just like on Earth. Rick reveals that this is actually a sentient species that has evolved in tandem with the dinosaurs, except in the opposite direction. It's kind of crazy Rick and Morty math, but it works. The dinosaurs feel so bad. The dinosaurs do a press tour, which I thought was pretty funny, and actually leave the planet in shame, like they're not bad guys. In fact, they just go straight to Mars and are determined to be taken out by the meteor once and for all so that there's no more life lost. But Rick, in his ultimate pettiness, doesn't want them to go out that way, so he goes to Mars with them and eventually calls their bluff, in turn saving the dinosaurs. So yeah, Rick saved the dinosaurs. Pretty cool. Though the most important part of this episode happens at the very end, when the dinosaurs decide to return the favor to Rick and end up closing the space rift that was opened at the beginning of the season, and reference pretty pretty constantly throughout the episode. Rick was obviously upset because he was planning on fixing that himself and made a joke about getting like a 3-episode arc out of it, but now it's just fixed. This looming threat is just gone. And by the end of the episode, Rick finally fixed portal technology. Thank God. It took him way too long. And he goes on a classic Rick and Morty garage rant, talking about all of the classic adventures they're gonna go on now that portal technology is fixed. Sidebar, these green spikes are super sick. I think this is the first time we've seen them. I love this show's design so much. Anyways, okay. So yeah, as goofy as this episode was, it was pretty major in terms of moving the story forward, and we finally got resolution to most of the major problems of this season. It was pretty big. So what do we make of all this? Well, let's start with the first question. Is the central finite curve closed for good? No way. For starters, both co-creators, Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon, have confirmed in interviews that we've not seen the last of Evil Morty. The finite curve may be closed for now, but Evil Morty can't return if he's locked out. This pre-existing confirmation assures us that the curve is going to crack once more, and I don't think Evil Morty is going to break back in when his whole plan revolved around him getting out. I think it's likely that Rick's spite and his need for conflict will be the driving force next time this happens. He didn't even want the central finite curve fixed, and definitely not by a Deus Ex dinosaur. And damn it, he's going to fix it himself. Now let's be real. Rick fucking with the fabric of space-time and smashing open another rift for the sole purpose of fixing it himself and preserving his ego isn't exactly far-fetched. In fact, that just sounds like a regular episode of the show.
I had to create a bomb. What? A bomb? We're gonna drop it down there and get a whole fresh start.
Now, I don't think he's literally going to go out of his way to make some high concept machine just to rip it open, but I do think the story will lead to Rick being forced to make a choice, with his decision resulting in the greater multiverse opening back up to the audience. Also, if we're being honest, no matter how much back and forth there is with serialization, Rick and Morty doesn't waste lore. Like, remember the Story Train episode a few years ago that took a jab at multiple storylines at the time, including the Galactic Federation, Bird Person, and Evil Morty? And since then, we've had all of those things followed up on and more. Even if we don't get a morsel of it in season 6, we could easily explore dimensions beyond the curve in season 7. I mean, despite it taking years in real life, Evil Morty was only missing for a season after taking over as president. And it's not like they didn't bother giving us anything in that absence, considering they got the whole Space Beth thing rolling at the end of season 4. But if we're being honest, I do think the season 7 pickup did create some huge pacing issues for the show's overarching story. Because the first season of that pickup, season 4, is when viewers really started to have these issues with the show. It's obvious Rick and Morty does have some sort of plan, no matter how loose, but that plan has been stretched out to last for over half a decade. And it's not the plan I think works for a show like this, a show that has proven time and time again that serialization leads to an evolved version of the show that's just, I don't know how else to say it, it's just better. I'm gonna be real tough. I think the writers may have decided to close the rift because they already have a lot to take care of. Rick Prime, Bird Person's daughter, I'm sure they're not done with Space Beth going against the Federation, still not letting go of Squanchy being missing, the list goes on. When you already have so much going on and you don't really plan to touch on going behind the central finite curve anytime soon, why leave a giant hole open for the audience to ask about, just like how people asked about Evil Morty every episode for years? Because the Citadel was just right there. Realistically, I think this move was just them learning their lesson and ensuring the audience focuses on the pieces they want them to focus on instead of the plot points they're obviously saving for later. And when it does happen, it's gonna be sick. Rick mourned that this could have been a whole 3-part story arc, and they could have just milked the rift for canon. And that line just reminded me of the Story Train episode so much. They're teasing us now, but they're gonna deliver later, and it's gonna be fantastic. Episode 7, Full Meta Jack Rick, was the interdimensional cable of the season, while also serving as a sequel to season 4's Story Train episode. And it was pretty cool.
This episode has a lot going on in it.
So to recap, this episode is kind of insane. Much like the Story Train episode that it acts as a sort of sequel towards, so much happens in 22 minutes. It's so dense and it moves so fast. It just makes you feel dumb. I felt dumb watching this episode, like I didn't understand it. But that being said, we're gonna try our best anyways. So the episode actually opens with a previously on Rick and Morty segment that at first seems real. We see Summer pregnant, Jerry dies from bees, we get the Sherlock scene from the opening, but as it gets crazier and crazier, Rick kind of wisens up to what's going on and actually uses the power of the segment to break out of it. Turns out the whole thing was actually this weird bug creature named Previous Leon. If you get the title, you're smart. They get carried through the theme song, it's pretty funny, and it leads to them fighting Leon, only for him to rip reality and escape past the fourth wall. Rick and Morty chase after him, and they're in this weird meta world that's outside of the fourth wall. It's really on the nose, and the show lets you know that repeatedly. This is when we're reintroduced to the Story Train villain, Story Lord, who's teamed up with Jesus as per the ending of the last episode. I guess he escaped that situation, tricked Rick and Morty into coming to him so that he can escape and find his real motivation. They get into a fight, but ultimately he escapes, leaving Rick and Morty stranded in the weird meta reality outside of the fourth wall. This is where things go from weird to just flat out confusing. Back in the real world, Story Lord finds the man who wrote him. To us, it looks like a Dan Harmon insert, especially because of all of his writing styles on the wall behind him, but that's not confirmed. Also, it kind of just looks like him, but who knows, right? Story Lord demands that he gives his character motivation, to which he quips, "Your motivation is motivation," but instead of that shutting him up, Story Lord runs with that, they team up, and things only get worse from here. Meanwhile, back on the other side of the fourth wall, Rick and Morty go and find the Story 6, a superhero group made up of storytelling tropes. It's fun. There's like a continuity person, there's a twist guy, they all have really clever names that I don't have them memorized, but you know, you watch the episode, they're pretty on the nose. But it turns out Rick's plan is to double cross them and break out a dangerous villain named Retcon with the power to permanently retcon reality. He's my favorite part of the episode. His power is so OP and interesting. They end up breaking him out, and then he immediately causes chaos, eventually retconning the entire universe into an orange. I don't know how he came up with that, but hey, it happens. Rick and Morty eventually escape this somehow. That's not really clear. I'm not gonna ask too many questions. But anyways, they almost die in the cold on the other side of the fourth wall, but they get saved by, of all people, Joseph Campbell, the prolific and historic writer, and a major Harmon writing influence. We'll get to that later. He saves them, gives them soup, haha, and helps them get back to the real world by way of crazy, super confusing Rick and Morty stuff. Morty gets pregnant, he makes some like anti-Semitic remarks, I don't even know. Anyways, it all leads to the machine that helps them get back through the fourth wall into their reality. They return to find that Story Lord and his writer have created a machine that drains everybody's motivation and gives it to Story Lord. This makes for some pretty funny bits. They ultimately have a showdown. Rick is ripped, by the way, which is something I didn't realize, and Morty teams up with the ghost ethereal projection of Campbell, using his galaxy writing brain to convince the writer to just stop creating, in turn stopping the machine, draining Story Lord of his powers, where he dies at the hand of Rick. For real this time. More specifically at the hands of a Rick plushie, which Rick actually plugs in the episode, leading to a real fake website you can go to. It's pretty funny. The episode ends with the writer insert character basically learning nothing and is about to write another horrible movie. Wrapping up what I consider one of the most confusing episodes of the show. It was one of those Rick and Morty episodes where you can just tell it was like very therapeutic for the writing team and kind of confusing for the viewer. But hey, we're all in this weird relationship, might as well embrace it. That being said, there is so much to unpack with this, so let's just go straight into the breakdown. For as loaded this episode was with their meta commentary, I think the point of this episode revolved around the fact that the team behind Rick and Morty is getting tired of excessive meta humor and the show structure at large, but they don't have as much control over that as one would think, potentially because of the higher-ups getting them funded in the first place. I think a common critique of Rick and Morty over the last few years is that the show can't decide if it wants to be a casual comedy that's not meant to be taken seriously while deconstructing various tropes a la Community, or a dark comedy that actually has something important to say through an overarching narrative about a man who's trying to overcome grief, complete with extensive lore, world building, and thorough character arcs. Rick and Morty has always been meta, but as Rick points out, as soon as the episode hits the ground running, this kind of comedy tends to work better when it's a small nod to the viewer instead of something that takes over the entire episode or undercuts what otherwise would be a sincere emotional moment or meaningful character development. As it turns out, Rick has issues with this too, calling out the fact that the premise of this episode isn't exactly fun. I'm sure this can come off as a little jarring since Rick himself is the master of meta, but I think this is perfectly in line with where his character is at in season 6. Rick previously embraced the excessive meta commentary the show provided because of the exact issue it poses to the viewer. Nothing could be taken seriously and nothing mattered. The mentality that Rick tried to emulate throughout the show's run as a means to keep himself guarded. But now, Rick's let his guard down to both Morty and the audience. Season 6 has seen a Rick that's a bit more vulnerable, one that we haven't seen since season 1. With that growth to his character and no longer treating the show as something with a lack of stakes, he's over the in-your-face meta humor that makes Rick and Morty feel like a parody of itself. Of course, this also serves as commentary on how meta humor has kind of consumed a lot of mainstream media in general. tons of shows and movies feel the need to constantly be self-aware, breaking the suspension of disbelief and lowering the stakes in the process. It's not even just fourth wall breaks anymore. How many video essays do you see on YouTube rag on the MCU for having the characters point out how silly the whole superhero thing is? Yet despite detesting this kind of humor, Rick and Morty seems to imply that they're forced into it because of how the show is perceived by so many of the people who clinged onto it half a decade ago when it skyrocketed in popularity. So many people know Rick and Morty as that meta show, when in fact its meta commentary was just one of its many strengths way back when. Something that was sprinkled throughout instead of being the main attraction. If you need to be convinced further that this episode was just one large vent by the team, let's touch on that season 1 line. It was pretty telling that the behind the scenes featurette for this episode basically tells us nothing about their intent in approaching this episode. Usually they show how the episode explores the arc of a character or the deconstruction of something that they really wanted to poke fun at, like heist movies. Here, it's just kind of 2 minutes of fun facts around the episode. It comes across like they have nothing to say, and this episode was just made to fill one of the 70 slots Adult Swim ordered. Yet that couldn't be further from the truth, and the truth comes in the form of this line right here.
Do some classic adventures, like season 1.
I'm so sick of that f***ing note. What the f*** does it even mean?
Now, the whole return to season 1 joke is something that's been said a few times in the show now, tracking back to the season 3 finale.
In many ways, things will be like season 1, but more streamlined.
However, this is the first time Rick's actually pushed back against that sentiment, saying he's so sick of that note and he doesn't even know what it means. If you're savvy with the entertainment industry, then you immediately recognized what this meant, but when making anything, whether that be a TV show or a big budget movie, you're going to get notes from the executives, the people in suits who basically dictate the show's future and are partially responsible for keeping the show profitable. These notes can basically come across as demands, and they definitely include the tone and execution of a show. So it seems like since at least season 3, since it's the first time they've made that joke, an executive at Adult Swim has kept Rick and Morty on a leash by constantly tasking the crew to keep it close to season 1. When you look back at season 1, you'd probably see the show's heyday, when it was still fresh and like nothing we'd ever seen before. But to an executive whose job is to keep the show hip with the kids and primed for endless hours of streaming, they see season 1 as something that's safe and episodic with an episode or 2 of lore. That format isn't what made season 1 special. Part of what made me fall in love with Rick and Morty nearly 10 years ago, oh my god, wasn't that it was self-aware and constantly took shots at itself. It was that it knew how to laugh at the tropes itself while still taking the characters and their own struggles seriously. Not to mention there was continuity that I don't think anyone expected, but was more than happy to have around. With Rick and Morty hopping universes, the introduction of the Council of Ricks, Rick's mysterious backstory, and the looming threat of the Galactic Federation, season 1 built up a lot that season 2 continued to delve into. But season 3 is around the point that began to lose the plot. There were still standout episodes for sure, and that goes for seasons 4 and 5 as well, but that incentive to tune in every week to learn more about the rules of the multiverse and see more layers of Rick's character get peeled back while still having a laugh at the absurdity of whatever mayhem they cooked up that week, that incentive was gone. At least for most people. We were tuning in at 11 p.m. sharp every week. We were real Rick and Morty fans, baby. To season 6 and even the end of season 5's credit, it's the first season in years to feel like season 1 with a status quo reset, continuity ramping up, and the return of genuine emotional moments that aren't always undercut with some sort of joke or jab at the audience. Still, Rick's frustration with that note seems to be the team saying, we don't understand what executives and fans mean when they say more like season 1. Season 3 tried to have a narrative with the divorce subplot that was followed up on every episode, while still having those episodes be their own adventures. That's kinda like season 1, but maybe season 4 is closer to what they were looking for, with only one big continuity driven episode, the season finale, while the rest are fun one-offs that can connect later if they really want to. Oh, that still isn't quite what you were looking for? How about season 5? Mostly episodic with some fun continuity in the last 3 episodes that ends on a massive cliffhanger. Still not enough? Fuck it, we don't know what you guys want anymore. This is way more common with TV shows than you may realize, especially animation. When a show gets really popular, the higher-ups funding the whole thing tend to get way more involved because now it's a proven success. Instead of just letting the team rock out and do their thing, they tend to become even more controlling and steer the team into making a show that's more to their liking, a show that they think will replicate the success it's already saw once before. Basically, any story-driven cartoon not made for a streaming service has to deal with this, artificially prolonging a show's overarching narrative by cramming a season's order with one-off adventure after one-off adventure. It's why you see so many fans disregard normal episodes as, quote, filler. You know why we're really here, so just give us the goods. Rick and Morty evidently is not immune to this, which makes sense. It generates more revenue for Warner Discovery than pretty much every Cartoon Network show combined. It makes sense why they want the team to play it safe and keep it in a format that's familiar to a mainstream audience. If season 6 can nail the landing with its remaining 3 episodes and deliver on another 2-parter, or at least a satisfying season finale, then I would argue that this is the ideal, quote, season 1 format they so desperately want. It's definitely the most excited people have been for the show in years, even if ratings don't necessarily reflect it, and I believe that comes down to the interesting insight we've gotten into basically every character of the Smith family and constant nods to the fallout of season 5's finale. Again, if they can put a neat little bow on this season with a hype ending, this might be the move. But with the show being written 2 years ahead of when we're actually going to get to see the episode, who knows if executives will feel the same way. I don't want it to sound like the team is being held at gunpoint to make any episode that isn't chock full of lore. I'm sure they have a lot of fun writing the abundance of one-off episodes that make up more than 75% of its run, but it's clear that a lot of grievances fans have with the show isn't completely one-sided, and like any popular show, there's just too many cooks in the kitchen, and some of those cooks aren't gonna let the show cook in the oven a little bit longer to become something greater than it already is. While the episode may or may not have been exactly mid-season premiere worthy, I did get enjoyment out of it, and clearly it left us with a lot to say. One thing certain though, Rick and Morty will never not be vocal about how the show's feeling, and it's always crazy to see. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go read up on who Joseph Campbell is, because apparently he's important for writers to know. Episode 8, Analyze Piss, was a major highlight of the season that showed us just how far Rick has come in showing a little empathy, alongside a major Jerry dub.
With this piss suit on, Rick feels good. It's not what he expected.
We open with Rick having a routine encounter with Mr. Nimbus, as Nimbus is trying to seize and destroy Rick's fortress on the ocean shore. Cause you know, it's probably bad for the environment and apparently is a waste of precious sea resources like clam and coral, I don't know. Well, this was a funny way to open the episode by calling back to Mr. Nimbus's claim that he's Rick's long-term rival. It also cemented to me that season 4 through 6 of Rick and Morty can really be classified as a new era of the show, separate from the first era of seasons 1 through 3, even though I know a lot of fans would want to exclude season 3. But think about it, the writer's room changed with one long gap between seasons 3 and 4. They knew going into season 4 that they'd have 70 episodes to toy around with, and there's definitely been a lot more continuity on things that were set up in season 4. Space Bath, Bird Person's Recovery, The Baby That Shall Not Be Named, we just had a sequel to the Story Train episode, and yeah, now Mr. Nimbus. It's a cool result of that massive pickup, with the writers being 2 years ahead of premieres. They've been writing season 8 as we speak. It allows them to create a lot of these characters or running jokes with the knowledge that they'll 100% be able to use them again in the future. They even mentioned recently that they've been planning out more of the Evil Morty and Rick Prime stories, so fans have a lot to look forward to. Anyways, instead of letting Mr. Nimbus destroy the fortress, a move that would be out of Rick's control, Rick decides to blow up the fortress himself by activating its self-destruct protocol. Rick tries to treat it like a draw, but Nimbus declares that this is still a win for him before going back into hiding for another season and a half. Good to see you, buddy. We learn that this fortress is actually a bunker for Morty, Rick going out of his way to give Morty a genuine gesture of kindness. He wasn't gaining anything from it other than Morty's happiness. Why Morty needs a bunker isn't exactly something they touch on, nor is something we're meant to really think about, but come on, you gotta be a little bit curious, right? Then again, when the president flips between being your friend and being your mortal enemy on a weekly basis, I guess I'd want a bunker on the beach too. Rick handling the situation by just blowing it up and covering his tracks mirrors his solution to a very wild problem later on in the episode. Shortly after Rick is confronted by Cookie Magneto, to which he refuses to engage with and instead chooses to go for an instant kill.
Fight me and find
Absolutely brutal. Oh my god. From here, it's pretty obvious what the subtext is to all these 90s styled goofball supervillains. They're haters, the people online who watch the show just to dunk on it, criticizing it at every move, and letting the team behind the show know that they think it's become a steaming pile of garbage. And this isn't just people who don't enjoy the show anymore or think it fell off, but just go about their day, you know, normal people. This is clearly addressing a certain type of the chronically online people who spend their days on social media, harassing the crew behind the show, eager to pick a fight. Rick prefers to disengage and ignore the haters, but Morty really encourages getting to the root of the issue and figure out what Rick's doing to attract these absolute freak shows. Rick claims he doesn't do anything to draw negative attention to himself, and if we look at this as a stand-in for the show itself, not doing anything to bait the trolls, then we just know that's a lie. Provoking the viewers is like one of the 4 go-tos this show has when it needs to crack an easy joke, right next to punking on Jerry, pop culture references, and the writer's poorly hidden fetish. God, am I one of those people that the show's making fun of? Am I that green bean God, I hope not. Oh my god. After the theme song, we witness Rick willingly attend therapy for the first time, as far as we've seen anyways, as he seeks out Dr. Wong's guidance, which paves the way for some more meta commentary.
I'm a walking target for a never-ending sea of angry nerds that think getting in a fight with me is some kind of, I don't know, platform.
I love how Dr. Wong's assessment of the situation basically equates to Rick and Morty holding its toxic viewers hostage by giving them a bunch of episodes they're obviously not going to like, while still milking them of their time, energy, and money for years to come, which is solidified by Rick defending this logic with,
I think it's the best I can do to profit from a situation and maybe set an example.
Wong encourages Rick to go a week without engaging with these nutjobs, believing it will see positive results, and he agrees only because he hopes to prove her wrong. Also, neat detail, in the trailer Rick smiles when he blatantly lies about his little goblin foe being alive, but in the show he keeps his straight-faced demeanor. I wonder what changed, I don't know. Fast forward to the classic family dinner, and everyone's excited for Rick finally embracing therapy. Real quick, notice there's an empty seat at the table right next to Beth, presumably for Space Beth. But their parade is rained on by none other than the Pissmaster. Yes, that's what I said. God, it's just lemonade. Definitely not some writer's fetish. I'm not gonna read into this one. Pissmaster, I'm just gonna call him PM, or more so his glider, is definitely reminiscent of Green Goblin, and his glider, his position, emulating how Green Goblin stands on his glider in almost every piece of Spider-Man media ever. Rick remains unengaged with the situation, but after some unsavory comments about Summer, Jerry decides to take matters into his own hands. From here, the episode just goes completely off the rails, as we get a legitimate crazy fight between Jerry and PM, with Jerry surprisingly curb stomping the guy, forcing him to apologize to Summer. Bro's been getting dubbed all season. I love to see it. Except what almost happened in the fortune cookie episode, but let's just forget about that one. It's buried deep in my mind. Jerry's brawl goes viral across the internet, because of course it does, which goes to his head pretty much immediately. But Rick warns his son-in-law that more trouble is going to follow him because he believes someone out there is going to be jealous of PM's position. A not so subtle way of saying people who get into arguments with Dan Harmon online inspire other people to pick fights because they want their 15 minutes of fame by getting absolutely humiliated. Instead, Jerry is rewarded by the arrival of the Council of Galactic Orbship, who bestows an orb of pure energy upon Jerry. Now, Rick's clearly salty that Jerry's rewarded for something he's usually punished for on a cosmic level, and to add insult to injury, the Council gives Rick the cold shoulder and dubs him unworthy of an orb's power. Rick still tries to stay out of the situation and mind his own business, but after being chastised for not helping Summer, again cosmically punished, Rick caves into the family's demands and helps Jerry figure out his orb, giving us, for the first time this season, a plot point that's actually reflected in the season's opening credits, because Jerry gets a 6th superpower with the orb juicing it up. Jerry just continues to fail upward by decimating a whole planet full of space Hitlers. Really glossed over that one in Star Wars. Unsure if anyone else was on the planet, but luckily he has 0 collateral damage and the galaxy hails Jerry as a hero. Flamingo Dad is on the rise, and Rick doesn't like it one bit. After all, why is Jerry being rewarded while he's being punished? This is a question he brings to Dr. Wong, only for her to point out that everything he's complaining about is a good thing. Jerry's making the universe a better place, and weirdos are off of Rick's back. Rick realizes that his cynical worldview is holding him back from enjoying positive change in a situation. Now, this is something that has been consistent throughout Season 6. Rick denouncing the nihilist mindset that so many people associate the show with, but this is the first time we're seeing him recognize just how much this toxic way of thinking has been holding him back. He recognizes that Dr. Wong is right. Ignoring the ops is way better than feeding into them. And after refusing to engage with the freak shows up close and personal, seeing that they'll move on to other targets, he feels free. But this is where the episode gets dark. Like end of the Unity episode dark. Rick goes out drinking for what feels like the first time in forever, but it leads into a depressive episode pretty quickly. One thing leads to another, and Rick finds himself at PM's doorstep. He rings the doorbell, but there's no answer. Rick lets himself in, only to find out that PM has committed suicide. Rick tries to revive him, but it's already too late. He's brain dead. Rick tries to bounce out of the situation with a portal like he always does, which would have been the first time he's actually used one all season, but he's prevented by the arrival of PM's daughter. Literally, when I found out he had a daughter, my jaw dropped. Oh, the last thing I expected. Begging through the door to see her father, saying if anything happened to him, she would feel responsible, and honestly, my heart just sank a little bit. Since season 1, Rick and Morty has always been a master of making uncomfortable scenes really uncomfortable, while still having an air of dark humor. Case in point, Rick masquerades as PM long enough to convince his daughter, but afterwards, PM's suicide note is found by Rick, and the guy, unsurprisingly, blames Jerry. All PM wanted to do was prove people wrong, so Rick decides to fulfill his dream by taking up the mantle of Pissmaster. Now, I was kind of wondering why Rick didn't just pluck PM from another dimension, but I think that boils down to the season's commitment to avoid using portal travel, even though it's now fixed, and the fact that they probably don't want to rely on the multiverse cop-out at every convenient angle. And in an arguably gross yet hilarious vigilante montage, we see Rick do his best Iron Man impression and redeem PM's image, planning to finish off this hot streak by staging a sacrifice, making it look like he died in a blaze of glory. A solution that surprisingly Dr. Wong vibes with, since it appears to be a healthy outlet, which I'm not sure I completely agree with, but I can't help but cheer Rick on given the circumstances. Plus, he doesn't want to keep the charade up forever, so he can only take the charade so far. The Council of Orbeez catch wind of the apology tour and want to recruit Pissmaster, much to Jerry's dismay. Unfortunately for Jerry, he's presented with an ultimatum: recruit PM personally or get booted out of the council. This goes over as well as you'd think. Rick is still able to successfully stage the death, but Jerry gets the short end of the stick as his reputation as Flamingo Dad is ruined and the council is heated over him attacking PM. Jerry explains PM's true identity doesn't help either, causing the council to confiscate both orbs, including Jerry's, and piecing out to do, I don't know, weird orb stuff. Rick decides to spare Jerry the weight of what really happened to Pissmaster, sticking with the claim that he was PM the entire time. Everything seems to wrap up in a nice little bow until Rick trauma dumps onto Morty, who in return refuses to carry the weight of this secret on his shoulders and immediately informs the whole family. While this ending is kinda just depressing, it goes to show why Rick needs therapy and why he should have just consulted Dr. Wong. He needs someone to spill this intense, confidential information with so it's off his chest. But something of that magnitude shouldn't be shared with a 14-year-old boy who already has enough going on. It should be shared with a trained professional who's equipped to help Rick work through his baggage. Or just keep it bottled up and repress those emotions, because in Summer's words, that's the cool move. Overall, this was definitely a season highlight, and one I can really see sticking out in the show as a whole, not solely because of its shock value, but because we got to see Rick not only try to make a positive change in his life, but completely reshape someone's legacy so they aren't remembered as a fool. Because of Rick, Pissmaster's long life goal came true, for no other reason than Rick having empathy for the guy. I don't know about y'all, but character development is always a win in my book, especially if it's a character as stoic as Rick, and I can't wait to see what they do with his character in the last 2 episodes of the season. Getting close to the end of the season, we have episode 9, A Rick in King Mortar's Mort, a stealth 2-parter that once again focuses on Rick and Morty's dynamic.
We're dealing with a Rick who is trying to be a better version of himself.
Rick is trying to be more passive in this episode. He's deliberately and consciously trying to change the way he responds to Morty's actions.
The penultimate episode of Rick and Morty's sixth season was surprisingly casual, focusing on the current dynamic between the duo as Morty spends the episode irritated and kind of weirded out over his grandpa's supportive behavior.
This isn't surprising. We've had multiple Rick and Morty address the relationship episodes. Acid episode, Edge Up to Morty,
and ironically, season 5's penultimate episode saw them break up after assessing their
But this episode feels different, and I think it's because for most of the season, we've been seeing these episodes from Rick's perspective. This episode is from Morty's perspective,
time around,
and he's reading all of Rick's development as some BS.
Bullshit.
Even though Rick and Morty have had plenty of interaction this season, this is the first true classic Rick and Morty adventure we've had. Most of the other episodes have the family
and the characters are written more like an ensemble, like Community.
In those ensembles, Rick tends to be the focus, and Morty doesn't see a lot of those crucial moments of
lot of those
So,
when
when
starting this episode.
the tone matches Morty's perspective,
who starts out the episode being a cynical jerk, have that much respect for the guy anymore, and he doesn't value his opinions, doing the opposite of whatever he says. Worst of all, he finds Rick.
Worst of all, he finds Rick boring.
It's funny. This is a reversal of how Rick treated Morty in the early seasons of the show. But because of all of this, Rick deciding to be more agreeable. It's cool because, like, Rick's really just taking Dr. Wong's advice, right? She advised that sometimes it's better to disengage
and let things play out without his involvement.
Without getting it. So
this episode is from Morty's perspective, who didn't see all of that. So there's a wholesomeness in Rick's voice that you obviously don't never breaks.
He's supportive through and through. It's a reverse bad Morty is ready for Rick to be a gloating asshat, but that moment never comes.
Or so we thought. When this episode initially aired, we believed Rick was just trying to exhibit healthier behaviors,
Can you really blame Morty though?
Now we know that after his initial disagreement with Morty near the beginning of the episode, he just straight up replaced himself with a robot. So yeah, all the stuff with Rick being nice to an unsettling
but have we ever seen him give Morty the reins to do whatever he wants for a selfless reason? But again, Morty has to take all of this
attitude in this
value.
episode. We've seen Rick take Morty on adventures out of spite and pettiness. We've seen him give Morty cool sci-fi gadgets to teach him a lesson.
But have we ever seen him give Morty the reins of this back and forth? Even in this episode, once Rick finally intervened, Morty was fine with it only because he felt like, so how is all of this going to pay off? Well, the first promo for the next episode is vague.
Last but certainly not least, we have Rictional Mort Poons Rickmas Morcation, another episode that pits Morty against the president while also setting the stage for bigger events to come in season 7. So this season finale kicks off with Rick absolutely blowing the family away with the perfect Christmas gifts. The Bats get a framed photo of their younger selves, and Rick from a universe where she wasn't murdered by Rick Prime as a kid. Jerry gets an extended cut of Miracle on 34th Street, a beloved Christmas classic from 1947, which notoriously was over 2 hours long when aired on cable thanks to extended commercial breaks. It ends up going on so long that not even Jerry is a fan of the extended cut, which is a great reminder that less is more. Summer gets money, the greatest gift of all. Let's not forget Rick is loaded, and Morty gets the conflict of the episode, a real lightsaber. It makes the sound and everything.
Does it make the noises? Of course it makes the noises. That's like half the fun.
Things get messy in record time, however, as Morty drops the lightsaber in a way that's perfectly vertical, causing it to plummet towards the center of the earth. And once it hits the core, according to Rick and Morty logic, it's basically bye-bye planet Earth. As Rick and Morty scramble to try and catch the lightsaber, Morty discovers that the Rick he's with is actually a robot, and the real Rick has secluded himself in his underground lab for literal months, switching himself out with the robot in the last episode after Morty sized him up as a boring old drunk. Rick telling Morty he'd be 22% more agreeable was an acknowledgement that Rick programmed this robot to be literally 22% more thoughtful than the real deal. Now I gotta give some credit. A lot of fans thought something was off with Rick, and who we saw last week wasn't actually him. And if you were one of those people, you just won verbal affirmation that you're a galaxy brain genius, and here's a cookie. I was under the impression that Rick was like growing as a person and taking therapy to heart, given all he's been through this season, but JK. Something truly is off if Rick isn't at least a little bit of a dickhead. I guess that's the rule of the show. It's actually kind of deep though. Rick believes he's no good to anybody until he captures Rick Prime and is able to put this living hell he's been trapped in behind him. He also believes that Morty doesn't respect him anymore because Rick was vulnerable enough to let him in and see his tragic backstory. And although Rick comes off as a jackass for a majority of this episode, there's no denying his heart is in the right place, at least when it comes to protecting Morty. The robot basically says as much towards the end.
Rick literally built me to make you happy, Morty. Anything I do is technically something Rick did.
Rick is trying to keep Morty safe by keeping him out of this manhunt because he doesn't want a repeat of what happened to C-137 Beth and Diane. Back in the season premiere, Rick was fine putting his own life on the line if it meant he had a shot at killing Prime. But as soon as Morty tried to involve himself and put his safety at risk, Rick folded and withdrew from the mission entirely. Morty was giving Rick an ultimatum, letting him know that his pursuit of Prime could only end in Rick getting killed. Morty just wanted Rick to let go of all of this and not stoop to Prime's level. But Rick just can't help himself. Prime is his greatest enemy, someone who can't get away with all the pain and destruction he's brought onto the world. Avenging his dead family is Rick's purpose. He can't let go. Especially after he got so close already. Like, Prime was shaking his bare ass in front of him, and somehow that wasn't the weirdest thing to happen this season. We actually see Rick analyze that booty when trying to narrow down Prime's location, seemingly giving off the identification 34C. Very interesting, since that weird, colorful dimension Rick and Morty went to all the way back in the pilot was labeled Dimension 35C. Definitely think there could be a loose connection there. Maybe it's an obscure reference, who knows? But jumping back to the lightsaber, the president catches wind of Earth's impending doom and decides to do a little science collab to retrieve it. Honestly, he should start a YouTube channel with how much he goes after the new trilogy, lamenting that Disney ruined the franchise. That's not a defense of the new trilogy. I don't care enough to have a stance on it. Leave me alone. Regardless, Rick has another lightsaber up his sleeve that's basically his contingency plan, a saber to stop the saber. But in an episode where everyone seems to be over Rick's shit, his own AI turns on him after a small back and forth, killing a lot of people in Italy in the process.
Excuse me?
I'm designed to stay perfectly vertical, not to give constant affirmation. You do your job, I'll do mine.
In a way, this episode echoes a sentiment from the season 5 two-part finale, in that Rick and Morty are really a match made for each other and no one else, as not only did Rick get screwed over by his AI, but Morty gets backstabbed by the president. As Morty retrieves his lightsaber, the president confiscates the weapon and reveals his true intentions of living out his nerdy-ass Star Wars dreams.
But make no mistake, child, I own Star Wars, not you. I earned this, not you.
While this is all happening, Robo Rick tries to play cool in front of the rest of the family, but with one person already knowing his secret, he's struggling to keep his robot identity under wraps, making it painfully clear he's not really Rick, and that he really just wants to be put out of his misery, though the family doesn't pick up on it until Morty blows the lid wide open. So they slaughter the robot and make his head the star of their Christmas tree. It's kind of beautiful in a dark, twisted way. These plots converge as the president comically drops the lightsaber again and launches the White House into space, throwing Morty under the bus to the rest of the world. So Robo Rick's rest is immediately disrupted so he and Morty can save the Earth and confront the president. Elsewhere, Rick manages to deconstruct a very elaborate, very explosive piece of technology from Prime's base that holds a USB drive that's capable of tracking down Prime. However, what starts out as a potential location turns into an entire map lighting up. Imagine Find My iPhone if every piece of Apple technology you ever owned was active and scattered across the country. Unless you don't buy Apple, in which case, congrats for not being a sheep, must be nice. Meanwhile, Morty and Robo Rick confront the president in space, leading to a crazy sequence of Morty going up against the president's Star Wars pitches, such as a robot with lightsaber eyes and a lightsaber Gatling gun, which is just so silly, yet something I could totally see making its way into a Star Wars movie at some point. The Gatling gun actually results in its little lightsabers falling, you guessed it, vertically into the ground and destroying the White House as it gets sucked into the vacuum of space. But before Morty or the president dies, Rick saves both of them alongside Robo Rick, who dies shortly after, but lets Morty know that his grandpa does care about him. The president goes back into obscurity for another like 7 episodes, while Rick admits that the robot is right, finally accepting Morty's input into things and letting him in on the hunt for Rick Prime. Rick explains that all of these dots on the map aren't just potential locations for Prime, they're all the places he is. What the actual fuck? It's like Operation Phoenix on steroids. Voldemort but with sci-fi instead of pointy stick Horcrux magic. The map implies Rick Prime is walking around on some Unity shit, with his consciousness spread throughout countless vessels in the multiverse. And we already saw that one Rick Prime is hard enough to kill, so the fact that there's this many of him, Rick has his work cut out for sure. They made sure things are going to be dragged out all the way to the 10th season, as Rick begins to act super unhinged, slipping into this season's rendition of the 100 Years Rick and Morty monologue, which is pretty much tradition at this point. He makes that aforementioned big promise to Morty and us viewers at home. Rick and Morty season 7 is going to be built around hunting Rick Prime and finally bringing him to justice. Rick also says that this hunt won't be every episode, which feels like like the writers drawing a line in the sand and making it clear we're never gonna go full lore. It's never going to be a serialized drama or an epic anime. It's all about balance. He even says it could be all happening in the background, which is how the story arc of this season kind of played out. We'll really just have to wait and see. It's painful Rick says this is the closest he's been to catching Prime, which is just painfully untrue, as we saw in the season premiere that the booty shaking Prime really was actually him and not a decoy. The stakes have never been higher, and I can't wait to see the mayhem that's sure to unfold with Rick and Morty season 7 next year. Also, Mr. Poopy Butthole has his semi-annual season finale cameo. He did tease back in his season 3 cameo that we'd see him again in a Christmas episode.
I might even have a big white Santa Claus beard.
Granted, we saw him again in season 5's post-credit scene where he lost his family and his will to live, but now he's getting shredded. He's drinking raw eggs. He has Carl, and then he breaks his body. He's probably gonna be paralyzed the next time we see him. I'm so sorry, buddy. And there you have it. Rick and Morty season 6. Overall, a pretty great season, full of amazing character moments, pretty interesting premises, and a lot of good gags. Could we have used way more Rick Prime? Always. But for what we got, and the fact that these seasons are now releasing on a yearly basis, I'm pretty satisfied. As always, we want to know what you guys think. How do you feel about season 6? Any standout episodes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below, and keep the conversation going at Roundtable Vids, or tweet to me at @IsRetroNemo. As always, thank you for watching. This was a Rick and Morty recap, and I'll see you next time. Peace.